So picture this. A man calls his mother from a hospital bed at 4 in the morning. Not a regular hospital visit, not a checkup, not something minor. He asks her to come. She comes. An hour and 12 minutes later, he is dead. He's 34 years old, and the sport that he had set on fire, the sport where he had won more races and more poles than anyone else just 3 years earlier, the sport where his red and gold Chevrolet had been one of the most recognizable machines on the planet, that sport responded with silence. No public memorial, no tribute lap, no moment of recognition at the next event. The local newspaper in his hometown tried to find out where he was buried and called every funeral home in Ashland, Ohio, and every single one denied handling the arrangements. NASCAR included one line about him in its official history. One line, and 0 photographs. A souvenir vendor at Pocono Raceway, a track where this man had won 4 times, told a reporter it was the first time he had ever heard the name. 3 years before that phone call, Tim Richmond had been the most electrifying driver in American motorsport. 7 wins in a single season, more victories and more poles than any other competitor in NASCAR in 1986. Co-driver of the year alongside Dale Earnhardt. He walked into victory lanes in silk suits, grinning like the night was just getting started, and the crowds loved him for it. And then, he vanished. The official story was double pneumonia. Then there was a drug test, then a lawsuit, then more silence, and then a death certificate with 3 entries that told the world everything NASCAR had spent 2 years trying to bury. This is the story of the most talented and most erased driver in NASCAR history, a wealthy Ohio outsider who lit the sport on fire and then watched it quietly let him burn. This is legacy motoring, and I spend way too much time thinking about the drivers history forgot on purpose. If you're someone who cares about the real stories behind motorsport, the ones that got buried because they were too inconvenient for the people in charge, make sure to hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up if this helps you out. To understand Tim Richmond, you cannot start at a racetrack. You have to start in Ashland, Ohio, where his father, Al Richmond, had invented a machine that could bore pipes under highways without digging them up. That single patent turned into a manufacturing company that exported worldwide and made the Richmond family wealthy in a way that was genuinely unusual in NASCAR circles. This was not a family scraping together sponsorship money and sleeping in the back of a hauler. Tim Richmond grew up with a private pilot's license at 16. One birthday, his parents gave him a Trans Am, a speedboat, and an airplane, all at once. His parents sent him to Miami Military Academy in Florida, partly because the family's wealth was creating complications at his local school. And he did not just survive there, he thrived. He set a conference record in the high hurdles, quarterbacked the state championship football team, and got his jersey retired. What he did not do was plan to become a race car driver. Here's the thing about Tim Richmond's entry into racing. It was an accident. In 1976, a friend of his father co-owned a sprint car, and Tim tagged along as a crew member. One day he took it out for some laps at Lakeville Speedway in Ohio. Somebody had a stopwatch. His times were faster than the regular driver. Just like that. No formal training, no years of go-karts, no racing lineage. His father bought him a car. He spun in his first competition and broke an axle. His father fired him as the driver. But the next season, Al bought him a super modified, better suited to his raw ability, and Tim won both Rookie of the Year and the track championship at Sandusky Speedway in 1977. After that, the trajectory just accelerated. USAC Sprint Cars in 1978, Sprint Car Rookie of the Year, Formula Super Vs at Phoenix, and then a phone call from Roger Penske's organization about an IndyCar ride. So picture this. A man calls his mother from a hospital bed at 4 in the morning. Not a regular hospital visit, not a checkup, not something minor. He asks her to come. She comes. An hour and 12 minutes later, he is dead. He's 34 years old, and the sport that he had set on fire, the sport where he had won more races and more poles than anyone else just 3 years earlier, the sport where his red and gold Chevrolet had been one of the most recognizable machines on the planet, that sport responded with silence. No public memorial, No tribute lap, no moment of recognition at the next event. The local newspaper in his hometown tried to find out where he was buried and called every funeral home in Ashland, Ohio, and every single one denied handling the arrangements. NASCAR included one line about him in its official history. One line, and 0 photographs. A souvenir vendor at Pocono Raceway, a track where this man had won 4 times, told a reporter it was the first time he had ever heard the name. 3 years before that phone call, Tim Richmond had been the most electrifying driver in American motorsport. 7 wins in a single season, more victories and more poles than any other competitor in NASCAR in 1986. Co-driver of the year alongside Dale Earnhardt. He walked into victory lanes in silk suits, grinning like the night was just getting started, and the crowds loved him for it. And then, he vanished. The official story was double pneumonia. Then there was a drug test, then a lawsuit, then more silence, and then a death certificate with 3 entries that told the world everything NASCAR had spent 2 years trying to bury. This is the story of the most talented and most erased driver in NASCAR history, a wealthy Ohio outsider who lit the sport on fire and then watched it quietly let him burn. This is legacy motoring, and I spend way too much time thinking about the drivers history forgot on purpose. If you're someone who cares about the real stories behind motorsport, the ones that got buried because they were too inconvenient for the people in charge, make sure to hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up if this helps you out. To understand Tim Richmond, you cannot start at a racetrack. You have to start in Ashland, Ohio, where his father, Al Richmond, had invented a machine that could bore pipes under highways without digging them up. That single patent turned into a manufacturing company that exported worldwide and made the Richmond family wealthy in a way that was genuinely unusual in NASCAR circles. This was not a family scraping together sponsorship money and sleeping in the back of a hauler. Tim Richmond grew up with a private pilot's license at 16. One birthday, his parents gave him a Trans Am, a speedboat, and an airplane, all at once. His parents sent him to Miami Military Academy in Florida, partly because the family's wealth was creating complications at his local school. And he did not just survive there, he thrived. He set a conference record in the high hurdles, quarterbacked the state championship football team, and got his jersey retired. What he did not do was plan to become a race car driver. Here's the thing about Tim Richmond's entry into racing. It was an accident. In 1976, a friend of his father co-owned a sprint car, and Tim tagged along as a crew member. One day he took it out for some laps at Lakeville Speedway in Ohio. Somebody had a stopwatch. His times were faster than the regular driver. Just like that. No formal training, no years of go-karts, no racing lineage. His father bought him a car. He spun in his first competition and broke an axle. His father fired him as the driver. But the next season, Al bought him a super modified, better suited to his raw ability, and Tim won both Rookie of the Year and the track championship at Sandusky Speedway in 1977. After that, the trajectory just accelerated. USAC Sprint Cars in 1978, Sprint Car Rookie of the Year, Formula Super Vs at Phoenix, and then a phone call from Roger Penske's organization about an IndyCar ride. The 1980 Indianapolis 500 was the moment that put Tim Richmond on the national radar. He ran the fastest unofficial practice speed of the month, faster than the race favorite Johnny Rutherford. He qualified 19th but was 5th fastest overall. Through the race, he ran up front, led a lap, and finished 9th. Solid for a rookie. But what people actually remembered happened after the checkered flag. Richmond's car ran out of fuel on the front stretch and stalled, sitting dead on the brickyard while the field rolled past. And then Johnny Rutherford, the race winner, pulled his car alongside the stranded Richmond and motioned him to hop on. Richmond climbed up on the side pod of the winning Penske car and rode into the victory lane with the champion. The photograph from that moment, 2 men on 1 car under the checkered flag at Indianapolis, hangs in the museum at the Indianapolis Motor Speedway today. They call it the Rookie and the Champ. That image tells you everything about who Tim Richmond was. He crashed, ran out of fuel, and still ended up in the photograph. The move to NASCAR came through a conversation with Pocono Raceway president Joseph Mattioli, who convinced Richmond to try stock cars after a string of crashes in open-wheel racing started to raise real questions about how long he would last in Indy cars. Richmond put it simply. He said in an Indy car you drove it, but in a stock car you raced it. He made his NASCAR debut in 1980 at Pocono and in 1981 ran 29 starts across 3 different teams, showing flashes of pace without a serious program to harness it. Then came 1982, a partnership with J.D. Stacy and legendary crew chief Dale Inman. On June 13th of that year, at Riverside International Raceway in California, Tim Richmond won his first NASCAR Cup race. He was 26 years old. He swept both road course events at Riverside that season, and Benny Parsons, watching him navigate those S's, said it was unbelievable. 2 wins, 8 poles, 7 top 5s in 26 starts. Not a full season, but an absolute statement. He moved to Raymond Beadle's Blue Max team for 1983 through 85, driving the number 27 Old Milwaukee Pontiac, and kept his averages steady. A win a year, roughly 10th in points, and the following in the grandstands that kept growing while NASCAR's establishment mostly viewed him as a talented eccentric who did not quite fit the mold. Now, you might be thinking, plenty of drivers have been outsiders. What made Richmond so different that the sport couldn't figure out what to do with him? Look, it wasn't just that he was from Ohio or that he had money. It was everything about the way he carried himself. He showed up to Daytona one year after Rick Hendrick had suggested he clean up his appearance, wearing a silk suit and carrying a cane and grinning at everyone like he was walking into a nightclub. He appeared in the 1983 Burt Reynolds film Stroker Ace. He got his haircut in New York. He pulled his racing suit off his shoulders to sign autographs for female fans. He called friends at 2 in the morning for no reason. He got the nickname Hollywood, and he seemed to enjoy it more than it bothered him. The garage did not know what to make of him. Dale Earnhardt's world was Wrangler denim and Carolina drawl and earning everything through grit and physical force. Richard Petty was Southern royalty in a cowboy hat. The sport had been born on backcountry roads in moonshining territory, and its culture still reflected that DNA in every way imaginable. And here was this wealthy Ohio kid who flew in on private planes and talked about going to parties with Huey Lewis. Kyle Petty, who was younger and sharper about the sport's future than most of his peers, looked at Tim Richmond and saw something nobody else was seeing yet. He said Tim was the guy who would carry NASCAR forward because he was the one who was going to capture the 18 to 30 market. Kyle was right about the potential. He was just wrong about what would happen first. In 1986, Rick Hendrick, who was building what would become the most dominant team organization in NASCAR history, paired Richmond with crew chief Harry Hyde in the number 25 Folgers Coffee Chevrolet Monte Carlo. And what followed was one of the most explosive and eventually heartbreaking partnerships the sport has ever produced. Harry Hyde was not Tim Richmond. Hyde was a World War II veteran from Brownsville, Kentucky, who had been building race cars since before Richmond was born. He had won the 1970 NASCAR championship with Bobby Isaac. He was gruff and methodical and old school in every possible way. He had spent decades learning to think about a race in terms of 500 miles, managing your equipment, managing your tires, managing your gearbox, making sure you had what you needed when the race actually mattered, not in the first 50 laps when it didn't. Richmond wanted to sprint from the green flag and figure out the rest later. Hyde said plainly that in April of 1986, he hated every minute of working with Richmond because Tim was so defiant he would not stop long enough to listen to anybody. Here's where it gets really interesting. The friction between them was constant and genuine. Hyde tried to teach Richmond to think about tire wear and brake fade and gear life, and Richmond just wanted to go faster right now. The breakthrough came at North Wilkesboro. Hyde took Richmond to the short track and ran a demonstration. 50 laps Richmond's way, then 50 laps Hyde's way. When they were done, Richmond's tires from the first run were destroyed, shredded. Hyde's tires from the second run were still smooth. The point landed like a sledgehammer. Richmond stopped fighting the old man's approach and they started actually working together. Think of it like a jazz musician who has been playing by ear his entire life, suddenly learning to read sheet music. The talent was always there. Hyde just taught him how to deploy it strategically instead of burning through everything in the first act. After that, the season transformed completely. In 1986, Richmond entered 1986 on a 64-race winless streak. He did not win in the first 12 races of the year. Then he and Hyde figured something out, and in the final 17 races, they went on one of the great runs in 1980s NASCAR. 7 wins, including Pocono twice, Daytona, the Southern 500 at Darlington, and the season finale at Riverside. More wins than any other driver, more poles than any other driver. His 1986 totals read like a Hall of Fame highlight reel. 7 wins, 8 poles, 13 top 5s, and 17 top 10s. The race at Pocono in July of 1986 was maybe the signature Tim Richmond moment. He crashed with Richard Petty early, lost a lap, worked his way back through the entire field, and then, with the leaders bearing down on each other in the closing laps, Richmond got into a 3-wide battle and won it by 0.05 of a second, about the width of a tire. He came on the radio grinning and just said, "That's a NASCAR finish." Darlington was the jewel. The Southern 500 was NASCAR's crown jewel event, the toughest track in the sport, with rough asphalt that ate tires and bit drivers who got lazy. Bill Elliott had been the dominant force in NASCAR that year, in the Coors Ford. But late at Darlington, Elliott's car hit the wall, and Richmond had what he needed. He won it and stood on top of that car afterward like a man who had just proven something to everyone who had ever looked at him sideways. Despite all of it, all 7 wins and all that dominance in the second half of the year, he finished 3rd in the championship, 288 points behind Dale Earnhardt, who had built an insurmountable lead through the winless first half of Richmond's season. 6 points separated him from second place. The what if is easy and painful. If Richmond and Hyde had clicked from race 1 instead of race 13, the 1986 championship was theirs. But here's what most people don't realize. Here is what makes what comes next even harder to absorb. Somewhere in that final stretch of the 1986 season, while Tim Richmond was winning races and standing on cars and looking like the future of the sport, he already knew he was sick. Harry Hyde started noticing something around September of 1986. Richmond looked awful. He was taking antibiotics constantly. After Darlington, he seemed to get better for a stretch, but by the final races, Hyde said he could see it in Tim's face and his eyes. Something was wrong in a way that went past being tired. This was not the fatigue of a long season. This was something else entirely. At NASCAR's annual awards banquet in New York on December 5, 1986, Richmond appeared pale and sweating. Humpy Wheeler, who ran Charlotte Motor Speedway and knew Richmond well, remembered it clearly. He said he could tell it was something worse than stress. Richmond told him he was just exhausted, but Wheeler was genuinely disturbed by how he looked. The next day, Richmond got a call from a physician in California he had seen earlier in the year about a persistent cold. The doctor had test results. He needed Richmond to come back in. Richmond flew to Ohio and checked himself into the Cleveland Clinic under a false name. The diagnosis was pneumocystis pneumonia, a lung infection that almost exclusively appeared in people whose immune systems had been destroyed by HIV. The underlying cause was AIDS. He spent Christmas hospitalized. He lost 23 pounds. He went in at 171 and came out at 148. You have to understand what an AIDS diagnosis meant in December of 1986 to understand why everything that followed happened the way it did. There was no treatment. AZT would not get FDA approval until March of 1987, and even then it barely worked as a solo drug and cost $10,000 a year. Average life expectancy after diagnosis was roughly 12 months. Rock Hudson had died 14 months earlier. Ryan White was fighting just to go to school in Indiana. The public perception of AIDS was that it was a death sentence tied to homosexuality and intravenous drug use, and a certain kind of lifestyle that respectable America wanted nothing to do with. In NASCAR's world, conservative, southern, working-class culture, where the sport had grown up from moonshining country and the fan base skewed heavily toward traditional values, an AIDS diagnosis was about as far outside the understood reality as it was possible to get. Southern boys did not think straight men could get AIDS. That is how Kyle Petty put it years later. That is the world Tim Richmond had to figure out how to navigate while the disease was actively killing him. The official story became double pneumonia. This was technically not wrong. The pneumocystis infection was real, but it hid everything that actually mattered. A tiny circle knew the truth. Dr. Jerry Punch, who was the ESPN pit reporter and had become Richmond's close friend. Rick Hendrick, whose mother Evelyn called directly to explain the situation. Humpy Wheeler suspected it immediately. He said when he found out Richmond was at the Cleveland Clinic, he knew, because that was where you went with AIDS when there was no hope. Everyone else got the pneumonia story. Richmond missed the first 11 races of 1987. Benny Parsons filled in driving the number 25 car. An early test session at Rockingham showed Richmond was too weak to complete a meaningful distance, and he went back to rebuilding his strength. Then on June 14, 1987, Tim Richmond showed up at Pocono Raceway. He took the lead by lap 5, led 82 of the final laps, won by 8 car lengths over Bill Elliott despite losing the ability to use anything but fourth gear after a gearbox problem developed mid-race. When he crossed the finish line, he told the media afterward that he had tears in his eyes when it happened, and that every time anyone congratulated him, he started crying again. In Victory Lane, he nearly could not speak. He just hugged his mother and whipped a towel in the air like a man who had been given one more afternoon of being exactly who he was. Team manager Jimmy Johnson said later that he had a 5-year-old son, and if his son ever became a race driver and won a race, it would still be second to watching Tim Richmond win at Pocono that day. He said nothing would ever top it. The next weekend at Riverside, Richmond won again, held off Ricky Rudd, and dedicated the Father's Day victory to his dad. That was his 13th and final career victory. He ran 6 more races after Riverside, and then at Michigan in August of 1987, his last race ever, he had to be driven from his motorhome to the car. He qualified 29th. He finished 29th with a blown engine. NASCAR's competition director called Hendrick after that race to say Richmond appeared to be in no shape to be on a racetrack. Richmond resigned from Hendrick Motorsports in September of 1987 to free the team to hire someone for the following season. Benny Parsons got the ride, and Tim Richmond went to Florida and disappeared again. What happened in 1988 is the part of the story that most people don't know, and it is also the part that probably killed him faster than the disease itself would have. In January of 1988, NASCAR announced its very first substance abuse policy. Officials publicly acknowledged that Richmond was one reason the rule had been enacted. He was then the first and only driver tested under the new program. For at least 2 years, no other active driver was subjected to it. Let that sink in. An entire drug testing program, and only one person gets tested. Richmond wanted to come back. His family worried about why. There were real fears that he might be thinking about going out in a blaze of glory on a racetrack rather than wasting away in a hospital room. But he wanted to race. So he found a car with owner Ken Reagan and showed up at Daytona for the Busch Clash All-Star event in February of 1988. Here's where the story turns into something that should make you angry. Knowing he would be drug tested, Richmond made a devastating decision. He stopped taking AZT, his AIDS medication, 6 weeks before the test to prevent any chance of it showing up in results. Think about that for a moment. A man with a terminal disease, a disease that was already destroying his immune system, voluntarily stopped taking the one medication that might slow it down because he was afraid a sanctioning body would use his medical condition against him. He also had his personal physician run a private drug test ahead of time. It came back negative. He had the sample sealed and locked in a safe deposit box in Daytona Beach Shores as insurance. On February 4th, 1988, he gave his official urine sample to NASCAR. 2 days later, NASCAR announced he was suspended indefinitely. PR director Chip Williams told reporters the specimen contained opiates and amphetamines. Now here is what actually happened inside that laboratory, and this comes from testimony and reporting that surfaced in 1990 through a WBBM TV investigation by reporter Roberta Baskin, who had access to sealed court documents and statements from former lab employees. Lab technician Bobby Tovar ran the initial test. It came back negative. At the direction of Dr. Forrest Tennant, NASCAR's testing physician, it was run again. Also negative. A third test found nothing. A fourth, more detailed test found high doses of pseudoephedrine, that is Sudafed and ibuprofen, both over-the-counter cold medications. Nothing else. Despite these results, the lab reported positive results for amphetamines and opiates to NASCAR. About 5 days after the suspension announcement, NASCAR quietly admitted that the substances found were only over-the-counter cold medications. Richmond passed the second official test. At that point, you might expect the story to end with Richmond cleared to race. Instead, NASCAR added a new condition. He could not return to competition until he surrendered his complete medical records from the Cleveland Clinic. Those records contained his AIDS diagnosis. Richmond refused. He hired Barry Slotnick, the New York defense attorney who had famously represented Bernhard Goetz, and filed a lawsuit for $20 million against Bill France Jr., Jim France, Dr. Forrest Tennant, Les Richter, and Chip Williams. NASCAR's legal response was to immediately demand Richmond's tax returns going back 7 years, records of every doctor visit since 1980, results of every test of his blood, urine, or any other bodily fluid since 1980, and his Cleveland Clinic records. They deposed his friends looking for evidence of drug use. Tim's friend, Terry McGovern, said the message from NASCAR's legal team was unmistakable. He said they wanted him to tell them that Tim did drugs. That was what they were looking for. They did not care about the truth. They cared about building a case. A former associate of Dr. Tennant named Gordon Griffith, who had his own grievances with Tennant, and you should flag that accordingly, alleged that NASCAR's competition director Les Richter had told him Bill France Jr. wanted to construct a drug program specifically to disqualify Richmond. Griffith quoted Richter as saying France was concerned about one particular driver who was outspoken and bizarre, and Richter believed must be a drug user. And Griffith quoted Tennant's alleged response as something along the lines of, "If you want something done about it, you have come to the best, because we can take care of him." Lab technician Bobby Tovar independently corroborated key details of this account, without any apparent coordination with Griffith, which is why it cannot just be dismissed as the words of a disgruntled former employee. But Griffith was a fired employee and was separately charged with making threatening phone calls to Tennant, so take the specifics with appropriate caution. What is not in dispute is what Bill France Jr. said on camera in 2006 in an interview that aired in the ESPN 30 for 30 documentary about Richmond. He said, "The test we did was not a good test, and the test got messed up, and we took him out." That is the president of NASCAR admitting it on film. Those exact words, "We took him out." Unable to race, Richmond hired a small airplane and had it fly over Daytona International Speedway on race day, trailing a banner that read, "Fans, I miss you, Tim Richmond." The lawsuit settled out of court in January of 1989. Terms were sealed. By that point, Richmond was far too ill to race anyway. Here is what most people don't realize about the timeline, and this is the part that should haunt everyone involved. Richmond went off his AIDS medication for 6 weeks to pass a drug test that the lab ran negative at least twice before reporting it positive. 6 weeks without AZT, while his immune system was already compromised by a disease that was killing him. Multiple sources have made the point directly. If NASCAR had not forced him into that situation, he might have lived longer. The disease might still have taken him, almost certainly would have, but probably not as fast. Those 6 weeks were not a neutral period. They were 6 weeks of an already weakened immune system losing ground it could never recover. Through 1988 and into 1989, Richmond retreated to the Florida condominium he shared with his mother in near total isolation. Almost nobody from NASCAR came. Rick Hendrick stayed close. Dr. Jerry Punch visited. AJ Foyt was one of the rare racing people who showed up. The vast majority of drivers stayed away. Kyle Petty was honest about it in a way most others were not. He said it all came down to AIDS, and nobody in the sport knew how to handle it, especially in a sport as backward thinking on so many things as NASCAR was at that time. Think about that. A man who had been their colleague, their competitor, a man some of them had raced alongside for years, and they could not bring themselves to visit him because the disease that was killing him frightened them more than their sense of decency compelled them. In 1989, his sister Sandra Welch described what Tim's days were like. He would go into his bedroom, close the blinds, and sit in the darkness day after day. He was angry, not just sad, angry at God, at what had happened to him, at everything. His mother told people she could not find words for how devastated he was, not just by dying, but by the specific disease that was killing him. The stigma was not separate from the illness. They were the same wound. In July of 1989, ESPN broadcast a NASCAR race at Pocono, and someone at the network sent a get-well card to the hospital and put together a video package of Richmond's 1986 Pocono victory to show him. Dr. Punch was there. He said when the footage came on, Richmond and Victory Lane with the team around him and the beauty queens and the crowd, the hospital staff who had been seeing the skeletal figure in a hospital bed every single day started crying because they were seeing who he actually was. And the distance between that image and what was in front of them was devastating in a way that words cannot properly capture. On August 13th, 1989, Tim Richmond called his mother at 4 in the morning. She came. At 5:12 a.m., Tim Richmond died in a coma at Good Samaritan Hospital in West Palm Beach, Florida. The death certificate listed cardiopulmonary arrest, gastrointestinal hemorrhaging, and AIDS. He was buried at Ashland County Memorial Park in Ohio after a private ceremony for family only. He had specifically asked that no members of the racing community attend. The local newspaper could not find which funeral home had handled it because all three in Ashland denied any involvement. 10 days after his death, the family held a press conference. His physician, Dr. David Dodson, read the statement. It said Tim died of complications of AIDS, which he contracted through heterosexual contact. The family said they wanted to go public, hoping others might be spared what had happened to Tim. When word reached the NASCAR paddock, the immediate reaction from several prominent drivers was not sorrow, but blame. Dale Earnhardt told reporters he believed Richmond had gotten AIDS through drug use. Jeff Bodine said obviously it was the result of drugs. Richard Petty appeared in later interviews with what one reporter described as visible disgust and raised questions about drug use while driving. That is the garage rationalizing what they did not want to be true. Because if Tim Richmond had gotten AIDS through heterosexual contact, then none of them were safe. It was easier to make him the problem, to frame his death as a consequence of his own recklessness, than to sit with the terrifying randomness of a disease that did not care about your lifestyle or your values or whether you were a good old boy from North Carolina or a rich kid from Ohio. Dr. Punch ended up sending more than 90 people from the NASCAR traveling show for HIV testing that summer. 90 people. That number tells you everything about how scared they actually were once they stopped pretending they were not. In the years that followed, NASCAR essentially acted like Tim Richmond had never raced. Here is where the contrast becomes impossible to ignore. Davey Allison and Alan Kawicki both died in 1993, and they became instant heroes. Tributes, memorials, souvenir merchandise still selling decades later. Rightfully so, their deaths were tragedies. But Richmond got one line in the official history and no photographs. A souvenir vendor at Pocono told a journalist in 1994 that it was the first time he had ever heard the name Tim Richmond, at a track where the man had won 4 times. The rehabilitation happened slowly. He was named one of NASCAR's 50 greatest drivers in 1998, the first major official acknowledgement that he existed. He went into the International Motorsports Hall of Fame in 2002. And then in 2010, ESPN released its 30 for 30 documentary about him, called Tim Richmond to the Limit, directed by Rory Karpf. And it brought the full story to a new generation. The drug test, the AIDS cover-up, the lawsuit, France's on-camera admission, and the voices of people like Kyle Petty and Darrell Waltrip and Humpy Wheeler who had been there for all of it. His sister Sandra Welch agreed to participate after a long time of not speaking publicly. She said she had worried about him being dragged through the dirt again. The fact that she had to worry about that tells you how thoroughly the sport had failed him. Larry McReynolds, who worked with Davey Allison and Dale Jarrett and Ernie Irvin and Dale Earnhardt over a career that spanned the golden age of the sport, said something in interviews around that time that is worth sitting with. He said in his entire career in NASCAR, Tim Richmond was the most talented race car driver in terms of raw talent he had ever seen. Not the most successful, the most talented. That is a distinction that matters. Success in racing is a product of talent plus equipment plus health plus institutional support plus time. Richmond had the talent. He had the equipment for exactly one full season. He never had the health, the institutional support, or the time. Kyle Petty said drivers who dominated the sport in the 1990s would not have done so if Tim had lived. He believed it completely. Rick Hendrick still wonders about the championships that might have been. As of right now, Tim Richmond has never appeared on a NASCAR Hall of Fame ballot. He is the only driver on both the 50 greatest and 75 greatest driver lists who has not been inducted or even nominated. There is an ongoing campaign by fans to get him on the ballot. It has around 5,000 supporters. Meanwhile, a road inside the Hendrick Motorsports complex is named Hyde's Way, after his crew chief, Harry Hyde. Hendrick drivers have run Tim Richmond throwback paint schemes at Darlington. His face shows up on merchandise. He exists in the memory of the people who watched him, but not in the official structure of the institution he lit on fire. And that gap between memory and recognition is where the real story lives. Team manager Jimmy Johnson has kept a private ritual since 1989. Every January, he turns his new desk calendar to August 13th and writes 4 words. Tim died 5:12 a.m. every year for more than 3 decades. That is not institutional memory. That is personal grief doing the work that the institution refused to do. Here is the thing about Tim Richmond's legacy, and this is what I keep coming back to every time I think about this story. It is not the 13 wins and 185 starts, though if you do the math on that win rate for the era, it is remarkable. It is not the 1986 season that, by any honest measure, should have produced a championship. It is not the 2 wins at Pocono in June of 1987 while he was secretly dying, though those 2 races belong on a very short list of the most extraordinary performances in motorsport history. A man who had lost 23 pounds and whose immune system was being systematically destroyed, leading 82 laps on 4th gear only and crossing the finish line crying. The real legacy is what his story reveals about who gets to be remembered and on what terms, and what happens when a sport or a culture decides that someone's death is too inconvenient to acknowledge honestly. In 1989, an AIDS diagnosis still meant something died with you beyond just your body. It meant your reputation, your legacy, your place in the record books could be quietly rearranged by the people who controlled the narrative. And NASCAR, which had either deliberately constructed a drug testing program to push Richmond out, or had run such an incompetent one that the practical effect was exactly the same, had every institutional reason to let him stay buried. Because acknowledging Tim Richmond meant acknowledging what they had done to Tim Richmond, and that was a conversation nobody at the top wanted to have. The rock star who died in silence has been getting louder lately. Maybe not loud enough yet, but louder. 13 wins, 14 poles, 7 wins in 1986 alone. A championship that was right there, and a June afternoon at Pocono in 1987 when a dying man in a car he could barely climb into led 82 laps on 4th gear only and crossed the finish line with tears streaming down his face. That is the story of Tim Richmond. That is all of it. And if the sport he gave everything to still cannot bring itself to put him in its Hall of Fame, then maybe the Hall of Fame is the thing that needs to answer for what it is missing, not the man who is absent from it. What if I told you that one of the most successful drag racing innovations of the 1970s came from deliberately making a chassis worse? Not stronger, not stiffer, not more rigid, but intentionally flexible, bendy, almost flimsy looking. While every other pro stock racer was obsessing over building the stiffest possible chassis, one Illinois genius was secretly engineering his Chevy Vega to twist and flex like a wet noodle, and it made him unbeatable. Now, before we get into this is legacy motoring, and I spend way too much time thinking about chassis engineering that shouldn't work, but absolutely does. If you're someone who geeks out over drag racing history and the wild innovations that changed the sport forever, make sure to hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up if this helps you out. Alright, picture this. It is 1974 at National Trail Raceway in Columbus, Ohio.
The staging lanes are packed with the biggest names in pro stock. Ronnie Sox and Buddy Martin are there with their Plymouth. Bob Glidden brought his immaculate Ford Pinto. Wally Booth is lurking with that gorgeous Oldsmobile Cutlass. These are million-dollar operations, factory-backed teams with the best engineers Detroit has to offer. Every car in the pits represents the cutting edge of what the big three automakers can produce when they pour their resources into going fast in a straight line. Then, this unassuming white Vega rolls off its trailer. The car looks normal enough from the outside, maybe a little plain compared to the flashy paint jobs on the factory cars. Bill Jenkins climbs out, walks around the car, checks the tire pressures, and doesn't say much to anyone. That is just who he is. Quiet, methodical, almost professorial. The other racers glance over but don't think much of it. Jenkins has been fast before, sure, but everyone figures they have caught up by now. But when that Vega fires up and makes its first pass, something bizarre happens. The entire chassis visibly twists during the launch. The body panels ripple like someone is squeezing the car from both ends. The rear of the car squats so hard it looks broken, like the frame just gave up and collapsed. The front end lifts higher than any pro stock car anyone has ever seen, and then it just hooks and goes, hard. Other racers are literally laughing in the pits. A few crew chiefs walk over to get a closer look, shaking their heads. Jenkins finally lost it, they whisper to each other. That chassis is junk. Look at how it moves. There is no way that thing is going to hold together for a full race day. Someone is going to get hurt. And then they see the time slips. 1.05 seconds into 60 foot. In 1974, that was physically impossible. The best rigid chassis cars in the class were struggling to break 1.15 seconds. Jenkins was not just a little faster, he was a full 10th quicker in the first 60 feet, which in pro stock drag racing is an absolute eternity. He was not just winning, he was rewriting the physics book. And that is the story we're going to tell today, how Bill Grumpy Jenkins outsmarted General Motors, violated every principle of chassis design that the automotive industry held sacred, and revolutionized drag racing with a Vega that bent on purpose.
Now, to understand why Jenkins's flexible chassis was so revolutionary, you really need to understand what everyone else was doing in 1974. Here's the thing. The pro stock class was only about 3 years old at that point, having been formally introduced by the NHRA in 1970. But in those 3 short years, it had already become the most technologically advanced form of door slammer drag racing in the world. These were not your buddy's street car with slicks and a roll cage bolted in. By 1974, pro stock had evolved into purpose-built race cars that only looked like production vehicles from the outside. Under those factory-appearing bodies were full-tube chassis, fabricated from 1430 chromoly steel tubing, and they were designed with one overriding philosophy: be as rigid as humanly possible. The conventional wisdom was simple, and it seems completely logical if you did not think too deeply about it. A rigid chassis provided consistency. Every launch would be identical because the chassis was not introducing any variables. The suspension geometry would not change under load because the mounting points were locked in place. The engine would not twist in the mount because the frame rails held everything perfectly aligned. The rear end housing would stay square to the chassis because there was no flex to knock it out of position. Everything was predictable, repeatable, and controllable. Or at least that was the theory. Chrysler's Direct Connection Racing Manual, which was basically the Bible for anyone campaigning a Mopar in competition, explicitly stated that chassis flex was the enemy of performance. They printed it right there in black and white, underlined it, and probably would have put it in flashing neon if they could have figured out how to do that on a printed page. General Motors' racing division published technical papers showing that torsional rigidity was directly proportional to elapsed times. The stiffer your chassis, the faster you went. Period. End of discussion. Ford's chassis specifications for their factory-supported teams called for deflection rates under 500 pounds per inch. If your chassis flexed more than that, Ford's engineers said you were doing it wrong and they would not help you anymore. Everyone agreed. Every engineer, every chassis builder, every crew chief, every driver. Stiffer was better. And on the surface, the numbers seemed to back this up perfectly.
The top Pro Stock cars of 1973 all featured heavily triangulated chassis designs, with torsional rigidity exceeding 8,000 pound-feet per degree. That is an incredibly stiff structure. To put it in perspective, a typical production car of that era had torsional rigidity of maybe 2,000 pound-feet per degree. These race cars were 4 times stiffer than anything you could buy from a showroom floor. Bob Glidden's Ford Pinto used a ladder bar rear suspension with 12 separate attachment points, each one reinforced with gussets and braces until the rear of that chassis looked like a steel spiderweb. Ronnie Sox and Buddy Martin's Plymouth Duster featured a proprietary 4-link design with spherical rod and bearings rated for 30,000 pounds of load. These were aerospace-grade components, the same kind of hardware you would find holding together fighter jet landing gear. The cars were essentially rigid cages wrapped in fiberglass body panels that were shaped to look like something you could buy at a dealership. But here is what most people do not realize. There was a problem that nobody wanted to talk about. Despite all this rigidity, despite the massive rear slicks, despite the perfect suspension geometry, despite the factory engineering support and the unlimited budgets, Pro Stock cars could not hook up. Not really. Not consistently. The class had hit a wall, and the wall was made of tire smoke. By 1974, the engines in these cars were producing over 650 horsepower from naturally aspirated small block engines. The cars weighed just 2,350 pounds with the driver. Do the math on that power-to-weight ratio, and you will see the problem immediately. These cars had way more power than the available traction could handle. The best 60-foot times in the class hovered around 1.18 seconds, and breaking into the 1.15 range was considered exceptional. Only a handful of drivers could do it consistently, and even they admitted it was more art than science. The cars would either blow the tires off in a cloud of white smoke, or the crew chief would dial back the launch RPM so far that the car bogged down, sacrificing reaction time and early acceleration trying to control wheel spin. It was a frustrating paradox. You could build more power, but you could not use it. You could bolt on bigger tires, but the rules limited tire size. You could add more weight to the rear, but minimum weight rules and weight distribution percentages were strictly enforced. Everyone was stuck. And everyone was looking for the answer in the same places. Better tires, better clutch management, better track preparation. Everyone except Bill Jenkins. Jenkins saw what everyone else missed. The problem was not too little chassis rigidity. It was too much. And look, Jenkins was not your typical drag racer, not by a long shot. While other Pro Stock competitors came from mechanical backgrounds, former mechanics, engine builders, fabricators, guys who learned their trade by getting their hands dirty and figuring things out through trial and error, Jenkins held a degree in mechanical engineering from Cornell University. Let that sink in for a moment. This was a guy who could derive differential equations in his sleep, who understood material science and structural dynamics at a level that most race car builders cannot even conceptualize, let alone apply. He had worked as a project engineer at General Motors before going independent in 1965, so he knew exactly how the factory engineers thought, what their assumptions were, and more importantly, where those assumptions might be wrong. His shop in Malvern, Pennsylvania had become legendary for building winning combinations, but what most people did not see was the method behind the madness. Jenkins approached racing like a scientist, not a mechanic. He kept detailed logs of every single run he ever made, not just elapsed time and speed, but weather conditions, track temperature, barometric pressure, density altitude, relative humidity, wind speed and direction. He recorded suspension measurements before and after every pass. He logged tire pressure data, shock absorber dynographs, clutch engagement profiles, engine RPM curves. His shop looked more like a laboratory than a garage. There were filing cabinets full of notebooks, each one meticulously organized by date and event. In late 1973, Jenkins started doing something that nobody else in Pro Stock was doing. He began analyzing high-speed film of Pro Stock launches. He set up a 16mm camera at the starting line and filmed every car he could, including his own. Then he took that film back to his shop and went through it frame by frame, measuring how weight transferred from front to rear during the launch sequence. He used reference points on the cars and known dimensions to calculate actual deflection angles and displacement distances. What he discovered contradicted everything the chassis builders and factory engineers believed. The rigid chassis cars were not transferring weight efficiently. They were fighting themselves. And this is where it gets really interesting, because what Jenkins figured out was so counterintuitive that even after he proved it worked, people still had trouble wrapping their heads around it. Here is what was actually happening during a pro stock launch. When the car leaves the starting line, the rear tires try to drive the car forward while the front of the car wants to stay put due to inertia. This creates a rotational force around the rear axle center line that tries to lift the front end and plant the rear. This is basic physics, and everyone understood it. But in a perfectly rigid chassis, this rotational force has to overcome the entire mass of the car instantaneously. There's no give, no compliance, no progressive loading. The rear suspension compresses because the springs and shocks allow it to, but the chassis itself does not help with the weight transfer at all. It just sits there like a steel bridge, refusing to participate. Jenkins used an analogy that was brilliant in its simplicity. He said it is like trying to lift a steel beam versus a rope. If you grab one end of a steel beam and try to lift it, you have to overcome the weight of the entire beam all at once. The beam resists uniformly along its entire length. But if you grab one end of a rope and lift, the rope conforms to the force. The end you are holding comes up first, then the middle follows, then the far end. The total weight is the same, but the force required at any given instant is much less because you are lifting it progressively, not all at once. Jenkins calculated that if the chassis could flex in a controlled manner during the first 60 feet, it would actually help transfer weight to the rear tires. The front end would rise more easily because the chassis was not fighting the rotational force. The rear would squat harder because more of the car's mass was being directed downward onto the rear axle. And critically, this weight transfer would happen progressively, not all at once, keeping the rear tires in their optimal traction window instead of shock loading them with a sudden spike of force that would break them loose. But this idea flew directly in the face of everything racers believed. A flexible chassis meant inconsistency, they said. It meant unpredictability. It meant weakness. It meant danger. Jenkins heard all of these objections and addressed each one with data. Inconsistency? He showed mathematically that a controlled flex chassis would actually be more consistent because it would self-adjust to varying track conditions. Unpredictability? He demonstrated that the flex could be engineered to follow a precise and repeatable deflection curve. Weakness? He calculated that the distributed loads in a flex chassis would actually result in lower peak stresses than a rigid design. Danger? He proved that the flex zones would act as crumple zones in a crash, absorbing energy progressively rather than transmitting it directly to the driver. Nobody bought it. Not one person. Jenkins did not care. He spent the entire winter of 1973 into 1974 redesigning his Vega chassis with calculated flex zones. And I want to emphasize this point because it is crucial to understanding what Jenkins did. This was not random weakening. He did not just take a hacksaw to his frame rails and hope for the best. This was precision engineering, the kind of work that would earn a graduate thesis at any major university. Every modification was calculated, tested, and verified before it went on the car. The main frame rails were 2-inch by 3-inch rectangular tubing with 0.095-inch wall thickness. That is 40% thinner than the standard wall thickness used by every other chassis builder in pro stock. When other builders heard about this, they were genuinely alarmed. They thought Jenkins was building a death trap. But here is where it gets clever, and this is the part that separates Jenkins from someone who just got lucky. Jenkins did not make the entire chassis flexible. He created specific flex zones with carefully calculated stiffness transitions between them. The front section of the chassis, from the firewall forward, remained fully rigid. He used traditional triangulation with diagonal bracing, gussets at every joint, and heavy wall tubing. This section held the engine, the steering, and the front suspension. It needed to be stiff because any flex here would affect engine alignment and steering precision. The rear section, from the rear door posts back to the tail, was also rigid. Heavy cross members, diagonal bracing, reinforced shock mounts, and thick wall tubing. This section held the rear axle, the suspension pickup points, and the fuel cell. It needed to be stiff because the rear suspension geometry had to remain precise. But the middle section, from the firewall to the rear door posts, that is where the magic happened. Jenkins eliminated the diagonal bracing entirely in this area. He used single cross members instead of the doubled cross members that every other builder used. He even cut small relief notches in non-critical areas of the tubing to encourage controlled flex along specific axes. He was essentially turning the middle of the chassis into a large torsion bar, a spring that could twist under load and return to its original shape when the load was removed. The engineering behind this was brilliant in its sophistication. Under launch loads, the chassis would twist approximately 2.3 degrees from its static position. Now you might be thinking, 2.3 degrees, that is nothing, who cares? But in the context of weight transfer physics, that small twist had enormous consequences. That controlled twist allowed the front end to rise more easily, reducing the force needed to initiate weight transfer. Simultaneously, the rear of the chassis squatted harder because the twist was directing more of the car's mass downward and rearward. The chassis was essentially acting as a torsion bar, storing energy during the initial hit of the clutch and releasing it progressively as the car accelerated through first gear. Jenkins calculated that this flex increased rear tire loading by approximately 340 pounds during the critical first 20 feet of the run. 340 pounds might not sound like much on a 2,350-pound car, but at the tire contact patch, it was the difference between hooking and spinning. It was the difference between a 1.15 60-foot time and a 1.05.
But the real genius, the part that truly separated Jenkins from a mad scientist, was in the control. Jenkins did not want the chassis flexing randomly or unpredictably. He installed adjustable limiting straps made from aircraft-grade webbing material that controlled the maximum deflection the chassis could achieve. These straps could be lengthened or shortened to tune the amount of flex for different track conditions. On a well-prepared, sticky track, he would shorten the straps to limit flex because the tires did not need as much help hooking up. On a marginal or cold track, he would lengthen them to allow more flex and more progressive weight transfer. He used specially valved shock absorbers that did not just control suspension movement, but actually dampened the chassis flex rate. The shocks were mounted at specific angles to resist torsional movement in the chassis, acting as dampers for the entire structure, not just the suspension. He even positioned the battery in the fuel cell at calculated locations to create the optimal center of gravity position during the flex cycle. When the chassis twisted, the battery and fuel cell would shift slightly, and Jenkins had calculated exactly where they needed to be so that this shift would enhance the weight transfer rather than fight it. Every single component on the car was positioned to work with the chassis flex, not against it. Nothing was there by accident. Nothing was left to chance. The first real test came in February of 1974 at Gainesville Raceway in Florida during pre-season testing. Jenkins unloaded his white Vega, the car his crew had nicknamed Grumpy's Toy, and immediately drew stares from the other teams. When he fired it up and rolled to the burnout area, other racers noticed something odd about the car. It seemed to squat differently when he did his burnout. The rear quarter panels visibly flexed in and out as the tire spun. The hood twisted slightly when he brought the RPMs up. It looked wrong. It looked broken. It looked like the car was going to come apart at any moment. A few crew chiefs from other teams actually walked over and suggested to Jenkins that he might want to check his chassis for cracks. Jenkins just smiled that thin little smile he was famous for and said nothing. His first full pass shocked everyone in the building, including Jenkins himself if he was being honest about it later. The car left the starting line with a 1.08 second 60-foot time and ran 8.86 at 152 miles per hour. For context, the NHRA Pro Stock national record at that time was 8.83. On his very first test pass with an experimental chassis that everyone said would not work, Jenkins was within 0.03 of a second of the national record. The other teams stopped laughing. By the end of that test day, Jenkins had made 6 more passes. His best run was an 8.81 at 154 miles per hour with a 60-foot time of 0.105 seconds. He had broken the national record unofficially since it was a test session and not a sanctioned event. But the numbers were real, the timing system was certified, and there were dozens of witnesses. The improvement was not just in the raw 60-foot times either. The flexible chassis made the car dramatically more consistent from run to run.
where the rigid chassis cars in pro stock would typically vary by 2 or 3 hundredths of a second depending on slight changes in track conditions, air temperature, or humidity, Jenkins's Vega was repeating within 5 thousandths of a second. 5 thousandths! That kind of consistency was unheard of in 1974. The controlled flex was adapting to different track surfaces automatically, just as Jenkins had predicted in his calculations. On a good, well-prepared track surface, the chassis would flex less because the tires hooked up more quickly and the rotational forces were lower. On a marginal track surface, the chassis would flex more because the tires needed more time and more progressive loading to find traction. The car was essentially self-adjusting without anyone turning a single knob or changing a single setting. It was brilliant. Word spread through the pro stock community faster than one of Jenkins's quarter-mile passes. By the time the 1974 NHRA Gator Nationals rolled around in March, every team in the pits was talking about Jenkins and his weird flexi Vega. Some people still thought he was crazy. Others were starting to pay very close attention. Jenkins qualified number 1 at the Gator Nationals with an 8.78 at 155 miles per hour. That was not just quick, that was otherworldly for 1974 pro stock. In eliminations, he was absolutely devastating. First round, Jenkins runs 8.80, his opponent runs 8.94. It was not even close. Second round, Jenkins runs 8.79, his opponent manages 8.91. Still not close. Semifinals, Jenkins clicks off an 8.78 while his opponent struggles to an 8.85. And in the final round against Bob Glidden, who was no slouch and would go on to become one of the greatest pro stock racers in history, Jenkins ran an 8.77 at 154 miles per hour for the event win. Glidden, running one of the best rigid chassis cars in the class, could only manage an 8.89. Jenkins had just won the biggest pro stock race of the young season, and he had done it with a chassis that every expert in the sport said was fundamentally wrong. The technical press went absolutely crazy. Hot Rod magazine sent a photographer and a technical editor to Jenkins's shop to document the chassis in detail. They crawled under the car, took measurements, photographed every joint and every crossmember. Their article ran 6 pages and still could not fully explain what Jenkins had done. Superstock and Drag Illustrated published a 3-part series trying to break down the flex theory for their readers. The editors admitted they had to consult with structural engineers outside of motorsports to even understand the principles Jenkins was applying. Carcraft magazine went even further. They actually commissioned a replica chassis to test Jenkins's concepts independently. They built 2 identical Vega frames, one rigid and one with Jenkins-style flex zones, and tested them back-to-back on the same car with the same engine and the same driver. What they found defied everything the conventional racing wisdom had taught them, but it proved Jenkins right on every single point. The key insight that the Carcraft test revealed was something Jenkins called resonant frequency matching. This is where it gets really technical, but stay with me because this is the part that truly shows how far ahead of his time Jenkins was thinking. Every chassis, every structure really, has a natural resonant frequency. That is the rate at which it wants to oscillate when disturbed. Think of it like a tuning fork. Strike a tuning fork and it vibrates at a specific frequency determined by its size, shape, and material. A chassis works the same way. Most rigid pro stock chassis of that era had natural resonant frequencies around 180 Hz. That means they wanted to vibrate back and forth 180 times per second. Now here's the critical part. The launch event, the actual moment when the car leaves the starting line under full power, happens at a frequency of approximately 2 Hz. That is the rate at which the weight transfer occurs, the rate at which the forces build and release during the launch cycle. 180 Hz versus 2 Hz. That is a massive mismatch. And when you have a mismatch like that between the driving force frequency and the structural natural frequency, the structure fights the force. It resists it. It does not want to move at 2 Hz because it wants to move at 180 Hz. The energy gets wasted in vibration and heat instead of being directed into weight transfer and traction. Jenkins's flexible chassis design had a natural frequency of approximately 8 Hz. That is still not a perfect match with the 2 Hz launch frequency, but it is dramatically closer than 180 Hz. And because it was closer, the chassis worked with the launch forces instead of against them. It moved in harmony with the weight transfer rather than fighting it. The flexible chassis also solved another problem that had been plaguing Pro Stock for years: tire shake. When a drag slick breaks loose from the track surface and then regains traction rapidly, it creates a violent oscillation that shakes the entire car. In a rigid chassis, this shake transfers directly through the structure to every component. It rattles the engine and its mounts, shakes the transmission, vibrates the driveshaft, unsettles the driver, and often damages parts or breaks things. Many Pro Stock runs were lost because of tire shake. The car would hook, shake, and the driver would have to lift off the throttle to keep from destroying something. Jenkins's flexible chassis absorbed these oscillations the same way a shock absorber handles a bump. The flex zones acted as structural dampers, soaking up the violent energy of tire shake before it could propagate through the rest of the car. The result was that Jenkins could drive through tire shake that would sideline rigid chassis cars. Where other drivers had to lift, Jenkins just kept his foot in it and let the chassis deal with the problem. Now, you might be thinking this all sounds too good to be true. And initially, General Motors' own engineers agreed with you. When GM's racing division first heard about what Jenkins was doing with their Vega, they were not impressed. Internal memos from GM's competition department called Jenkins's design theoretically unsound and predicted it was unlikely to produce results and likely to result in catastrophic structural failure. They were so convinced Jenkins was wrong that they sent a team of 4 engineers to the 1974 NHRA Spring Nationals specifically to study his car and document its inevitable failure. What those engineers found changed everything GM thought they knew about chassis design. The GM engineering team used strain gauges bonded to critical points on Jenkins' chassis, triaxle accelerometers mounted at the rear axle on the driver's seat, and high-speed cameras running at 500 frames per second. They collected data on 6 of Jenkins's runs over the course of the event weekend. Their analysis revealed something remarkable that none of them had predicted. During launch, a conventional rigid Pro Stock chassis experienced stress concentrations exceeding 85,000 pounds per square inch at the primary mounting points. That is dangerously close to the yield strength of 4130 chromoly steel, which means the rigid chassis cars were actually closer to structural failure than Jenkins's flexible design. Jenkins's chassis never exceeded 45,000 psi anywhere in the structure. The flex was distributing the loads more evenly across a larger area of the chassis, effectively making it stronger under racing conditions, not weaker, the opposite of what everyone had assumed. The accelerometer data was even more revealing. Rigid chassis cars showed vertical acceleration spikes of 4.2 Gs at the rear tires during the launch event. That is the force slamming down on the tires at the moment of launch. Jenkins's car showed 2.8 Gs. Lower peak acceleration meant the tires were less likely to be shock-loaded past their traction limit. But here is the part that really made the GM engineers sit up in their chairs. The overall weight transfer, the total amount of load that moved from the front tires to the rear tires during the launch, was actually greater with the flexible chassis. Jenkins's car transferred more weight, but it did it more smoothly and progressively, keeping the rear tires in their optimal traction window throughout the entire launch sequence, instead of spiking past the traction limit and then dropping back below it. GM's final report on their investigation concluded that Jenkins had, and this is a direct quote from the documents, revolutionized understanding of chassis dynamics in drag racing applications. Coming from the same company that had called his work theoretically unsound just months earlier, that was quite an admission. They immediately began developing their own flexible chassis designs for factory-backed teams. Within 6 months of that report being circulated, every major Pro Stock competitor was experimenting with some form of controlled chassis flex. The variations that other teams came up with were fascinating in their own right. Ronnie Sox and Buddy Martin developed what they called a beam pivot design, where the main frame rails could rotate around the central pivot point located near the center of gravity. Bob Glidden created what he termed a torsional cell chassis, using hollow rectangular sections with specific wall thicknesses that could twist predictably along their length. Don Nicholson, always an innovator, built what he called a harmonic flex design, with different wall thicknesses at different points along the frame rails, creating multiple resonant frequencies that could be tuned independently. But every single one of these designs was chasing the breakthrough that Jenkins had made first. They were all variations on his theme. The impact on pro stock performance was immediate and dramatic. By the end of the 1974 season, the NHRA Pro Stock National Elapsed Time record had dropped from 8.83 to 8.68. 60-foot times that had been stuck at 1.15 for what felt like forever suddenly plummeted below 1.10. Jenkins himself reset the national record 4 times during the 1974 season, ultimately running 8.63 at 157.21 miles per hour. More importantly, the cars became easier to drive. The controlled flex made them more forgiving of imperfect track conditions, more consistent from run to run, and more predictable in how they responded to driver inputs. This was not just about going faster, it was about making speed accessible. Jenkins did not stop innovating after that first season. For 1975, he developed what he called active flex control, and this is where the story moves from impressive to almost unbelievable. The active flex system used hydraulic cylinders mounted at the flex zones to adjust the chassis stiffness while the car was running. Sensors measured wheel speed, drive shaft speed, and longitudinal G-forces. A simple analog computer, really just an arrangement of potentiometers and operational amplifiers mounted in a small aluminum box, calculated the optimal flex rate for the current conditions and adjusted the hydraulic pressure accordingly. The system could stiffen the chassis for high-speed stability in the top half of the track, and then soften it automatically for the next launch. It could even adjust side-to-side flex to compensate for crosswinds or an uneven track surface. In testing, the active system improved 60-foot times by another 0.02 of a second and added 2 miles per hour to trap speeds. But NHRA banned the system before Jenkins could ever race it in competition. They classified it as an electronic driving aid, which was prohibited under pro stock rules. The irony was rich. The system was not electronic at all. It was hydraulic with analog controls. There was not a single transistor or microchip anywhere in it. But NHRA was not ready for that level of sophistication in 1975. And honestly, you can understand their concern. If they allowed active chassis control, where would it end? Jenkins was philosophical about the ban. He said he expected it and had the system ready primarily as a proof of concept for future development. He was thinking 10, 20 years ahead of the sanctioning body. The flexible chassis concept did not stay confined to pro stock. Top Fuel dragster teams started experimenting with controlled flex in their 300-inch wheelbase rail chassis. Funny car builders incorporated flex zones between the carbon fiber driver compartment and the rear engine mounting structure. Even pro-modified cars, those wild tube chassis machines with centrifugal superchargers and nitrous oxide, adopted flexible subframes based on Jenkins' principles. The entire sport of drag racing had been transformed by one man's willingness to question what everybody else accepted as gospel truth. The real validation of Jenkins's work came from an unexpected source entirely outside of motorsports. In 1976, Chrysler's Aerospace division was contracted by the United States Department of Defense to design a new transporter erector launcher for mobile missile systems. The requirements called for a vehicle that could maintain stability while carrying a 40,000-pound ballistic missile over rough terrain at speeds up to 50 miles per hour. The preliminary designs all featured massive, rigid chassis structures with complex multi-link suspension systems and active stabilization platforms. The projected cost was enormous, and the weight was prohibitive. Then, someone in the engineering department remembered reading about Jenkins's flexible Vega in a technical journal. Chrysler's aerospace engineers applied Jenkins's controlled flex principles to the missile transporter chassis. Instead of fighting rough terrain with the rigidity and brute strength, they designed the chassis that could flex predictably, absorbing impacts and terrain irregularities while maintaining load stability through progressive compliance rather than absolute resistance. The prototype exceeded every single requirement in the specification. It was lighter than the rigid design, cheaper to manufacture, easier to maintain, and more reliable in field testing. The project led to a multi-million-dollar military contract that kept Chrysler's defense division profitable for years. The official engineering report credited drag racing innovation, specifically citing Jenkins's flexible chassis theory as the foundational concept. A Chevy Vega drag car helped design a missile launcher. You cannot make this stuff up. Jenkins himself was characteristically philosophical about his innovation. In a 1976 interview with National Dragster magazine, he said something that has stuck with me ever since I first read it. He said, "While everyone was trying to eliminate chassis flex, I just asked, what if we use it instead?" Racing is not about following rules. It is about questioning them. Every breakthrough comes from someone willing to look stupid until they prove everyone else wrong. That quote belongs in a frame on the wall of every engineering school in the country. The numbers tell the final story better than any words can. Before Jenkins's flexible chassis, pro stock cars struggled to run in the 8.80 range. Within 2 years of his innovation, the class record stood at 8.48. 60-foot times dropped from 1.15 to 1.02. But the numbers do not capture the most important change. The class became more competitive across the board. The controlled flex technology made the cars easier to tune, more forgiving to drive, and more consistent from run to run regardless of conditions. It democratized performance. You no longer needed a factory contract and unlimited resources to be competitive. You needed understanding of the principles. And thanks to Jenkins's willingness to share his knowledge openly, those principles were available to anyone who wanted to learn them. Jenkins's flexible Vega won 13 national events between 1974 and 1976. He captured the 1974 NHRA Pro Stock Championship outright and finished second in 1975, losing the title by just a handful of points. But his real victory was not measured in trophies or championships. It was measured in changed minds and transformed approaches. He proved that sometimes the solution to a problem is not to fight harder against the obstacle, but to work with it more intelligently. He showed that the answer was not always more, sometimes it was different. Today, every single pro stock car that rolls into the staging lanes uses controlled chassis flex. Modern chassis builders use finite element analysis software to map flex patterns with precision that Jenkins could only dream of with his slide rules and hand calculations. They employ exotic materials like carbon fiber composites and titanium alloys to create precise flex zones with specific stiffness profiles. Computer simulations optimize every tube placement, every gusset angle, every wall thickness for perfect controlled deflection under every conceivable loading condition. But they are all following the path that Bill Jenkins blazed with his weird, flexy, too thin Vega chassis back in 1974. The current NHRA Pro Stock record stands at 6.43 seconds at 213 miles per hour. These modern cars generate over 1,500 horsepower from naturally aspirated engines and pull nearly 6 Gs on launch. They achieve 60-foot times under 0.97 seconds. None of this, not a single tenth of a second of it, would be possible with rigid chassis designs. The controlled flex that Jenkins pioneered is what allows these cars to hook up and accelerate harder than physics should reasonably allow. The lesson here extends far beyond drag racing, and it is a lesson worth remembering. Jenkins showed that questioning fundamental assumptions, even ones that everyone agrees on, even ones backed by factory engineers and published data and decades of experience, can lead to breakthrough innovations that change everything. He proved that sometimes the wrong answer is actually the right answer. You just have to understand the problem deeply enough to see why. He demonstrated that engineering is not about blindly following formulas and accepted practices. It is about understanding the underlying principles so thoroughly that you know when to break the rules and why breaking them will work. Consider what Jenkins was up against. General Motors, with effectively unlimited engineering resources and armies of degreed engineers, said he was wrong. The entire pro stock racing community, filled with successful competitors and experienced chassis builders who had decades of combined experience, said rigid was right and flex was dangerous. Automotive engineering textbooks going back to the beginning of the automobile preached the gospel of chassis stiffness as an absolute good. But Jenkins had something more powerful than consensus. He had data, he had curiosity, and he had the courage to trust his own calculations over conventional wisdom, even when every voice around him said he was making a mistake. In 2012, Jenkins was inducted into the International Drag Racing Hall of Fame. The citation specifically mentioned his revolutionary flexible chassis design that transformed pro stock racing and influenced chassis engineering across all forms of motorsport. At the ceremony, Jenkins, then 81 years old, stood at a whiteboard and demonstrated his original calculations, walking the audience through the mathematics of how he had derived the optimal flex rates and resonant frequencies for that first Vega chassis. The audience, a room full of engineers, racers, and motorsport professionals, gave him a 5-minute standing ovation. Jenkins passed away later that same year, but his influence continues every single day in every form of motorsport. Every time a pro stock car launches from the starting line, flexing and twisting as it rockets down the quarter mile, it is validating his vision. Every 0.96 second 60-foot time is a testament to his willingness to question what everyone else accepted without question. Every championship won by a car with controlled chassis flex is part of his enduring legacy. The story of Bill Jenkins and his flexible Vega chassis is more than just a fascinating chapter in racing history. It is a reminder that innovation almost always comes from questioning what everyone knows to be true. It is proof that one person armed with calculations and courage can outsmart entire corporations with unlimited budgets. It is evidence that sometimes the best solution is the one that looks completely wrong to everyone else watching. Racing has always been about going faster than the other guy, but Jenkins showed us it is also about thinking differently than the other guy. While they built stronger, he built smarter. While they added rigidity, he added intelligence. While they fought physics with brute force, he made physics his most valuable ally. That white Vega with the weird chassis that flexed on purpose, the car that made veteran racers laugh and factory engineers shake their heads, it did not just win races, it changed racing forever. And it all started with one quiet engineer in Pennsylvania who was willing to ask the simplest and most dangerous question in all of science and engineering. What if everyone else is wrong? So what is the most counterintuitive modification you have ever seen actually work? Drop a comment below and let me know. I want to hear your stories about the times when the wrong answer turned out to be exactly right. And if you enjoyed this deep dive into the drag racing innovation that changed everything, make sure to subscribe because we are just getting started exploring the engineering marvels that transformed motorsports. Until next time, keep questioning the obvious. I'll see you at the track. Picture this. It's 1983. The heart of Charlotte Motor Speedway, heat rising off the asphalt in waves you can practically see from the grandstands. And somewhere, deep inside the garage area, behind the wall of toolboxes and tire racks, Richard Petty's crew chief is about to pull off one of the most audacious cheating schemes in the entire history of NASCAR. Now, while every other team in the paddock is obsessing over aerodynamic profiles, engine displacement tolerances, and carburetor jetting, this mechanic decides to do something so breathtakingly simple, so brazenly obvious in hindsight, that when NASCAR officials finally catch on, they will fine the team $35,000 and strip them of 104 championship points. The weapon of choice was not some exotic fuel additive or a cleverly hidden nitrous system. It was 4 inches of rubber that should not have existed on those wheels. 4 inches that rewrote the physics of that Pontiac and gave the king an edge nobody could see, nobody could measure, and nobody even thought to look for. This is a story of how one mechanic's illegal tire modification changed NASCAR forever, exposed the sport's single biggest vulnerability, and proved once and for all that sometimes the simplest tricks are the most absolutely devastating. This is legacy motoring, and I spend way too much time thinking about the invisible engineering tricks that changed motorsport history. If you're someone who obsesses over the hidden technical details behind NASCAR's most infamous scandals and wants to understand how a few inches of rubber rewrote the rulebook, make sure to hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up if this helps you out. Now, to really understand why oversized tires were such a game changer, we need to travel back in time and immerse ourselves in the world of NASCAR in the early 1980s. This was, without exaggeration, the golden age of creative rule interpretation. Teams were not just racing each other on Sunday afternoon in front of packed grandstands and millions of television viewers. They were engaged in a constant, relentless, never-ending technological arms race from Monday morning through Saturday night. The rulebook in those days was more of a polite suggestion than holy scripture, and the unofficial motto that echoed through every garage from Daytona to Darlington was simple: if you are not cheating, you are not trying hard enough. Here's the thing. Richard Petty, the king himself, was already a living legend by 1983. 7 Cup championships, 198 career victories, a reputation that somehow managed to blend the image of a gentleman racer with that of a fierce, uncompromising competitor. The man signed autographs for every single fan who asked, and he drove like he was trying to put you into the wall if you dared challenge him for position. But even kings need an edge. And in the world of NASCAR, that edge almost always came from the garage, not from the driver's seat. The difference between winning and finishing 10th was rarely about who had the most talent behind the wheel. It was about who had the smartest, most creative, most willing to push boundaries crew back in the shop. Petty's crew chief and the mechanics working on that iconic number 43 Pontiac understood something fundamental about oval track racing that seems painfully obvious now, but was genuinely revolutionary thinking at the time. On an oval, you are constantly turning left. Every lap, every corner, every single moment of competitive racing involves the car rotating to the left. The car's weight transfers to the right side through those corners, loading up the right side tires and suspension components with enormous force. But the left side tires are doing something equally critical that most people overlook entirely. They are maintaining the car's stability. They are controlling the rate of rotation. They are determining how quickly and how smoothly the car can change direction. More grip on the left side does not just mean marginally faster cornering speeds, it means the entire physics equation of the car fundamentally changes. The balance shifts, the handling transforms, the driver's confidence skyrockets, and that confidence, that trust in the machine beneath you, translates directly into speed. Here is where the genius of the scheme really reveals itself. NASCAR had strict, clearly defined rules about tire specifications. Every single team in the field had to use the same Goodyear Eagles mounted on 15-inch wheels, inflated to specific pressures mandated by the sanctioning body, and most importantly, sized exactly to NASCAR's published specifications. Before every race, officials would check tire compounds under controlled conditions. They would examine tread patterns for any unauthorized modifications. They would verify date codes stamped into the sidewalls to ensure nobody was running specially manufactured rubber that had been cooked up in some secret Goodyear laboratory. The inspection process was thorough for its era, and most teams accepted that tires were one area where you simply could not gain an advantage. The sanctioning body had that box locked down tight, or so everyone believed. The mechanic's solution to the problem of gaining a tire advantage was breathtakingly, almost insultingly simple. He did not change the tire compound. He did not alter the tread pattern or experiment with exotic rubber formulations. He did not mess with special materials or chemical treatments that might change the way the rubber interacted with asphalt at different temperatures. He just made the left side tires bigger, 4 inches bigger in circumference to be exact. That is it. That was the entire scheme in its beautiful, elegant simplicity. Bigger tires on the left side of the car. Now, you might be thinking 4 inches does not sound like much, and on a tire that already measures approximately 87 inches in circumference, we're talking about less than a 5% increase. Barely noticeable to the naked eye, virtually invisible when mounted on the rim and inflated to proper pressure. But here's what most people do not realize about racing. In this world, victories are measured in hundreds of seconds. Positions are won and lost by inches. Championships are decided by margins so slim they would be considered statistical noise in any other context. In that world, a nearly 5% increase in left side tire circumference is not just significant, it is massive. It is the difference between qualifying 15th and qualifying on the second row. It is the gap between running in the middle of the pack and genuinely contending for race wins every single weekend. The technical execution of this scheme was nothing short of masterful. These were not simply standard tires that had been stretched on the rim or overinflated to artificially increase their diameter. That kind of amateur hour modification would have been immediately obvious to any inspector who had been around racing tires for more than a week. No. These were specially manufactured tires that looked identical to legal Goodyear Eagles in every single measurable way except their actual rolling circumference. When mounted on the rim, inflated to the proper NASCAR-mandated pressure and subjected to a standard visual inspection, they appeared completely, utterly normal. You would need to actually wrap a tape measure around the tire and measure the rolling circumference to catch the difference. And in 1983, absolutely nobody was doing that. It simply was not part of the inspection protocol. Nobody had ever thought to check because nobody had ever imagined someone would try something this brazen. Think about what those extra 4 inches actually meant when that Pontiac hit the track at speed. First, and most obviously, there is the contact patch. A larger tire, even one that is only slightly larger in circumference, puts more rubber on the asphalt surface. More rubber in contact with the track means more mechanical grip. More grip means higher cornering speeds, which on oval track, where you spend roughly 60% of every lap in a corner, is an enormous competitive advantage. But that increase in contact patch is really just the beginning of the story. This is where it gets really interesting. The larger circumference also changed the effective gear ratio on the left side of the car. Now, this is a concept that trips up even experienced racing enthusiasts, so let me break it down with an analogy. Imagine you have 2 wheels on a bicycle, but one is slightly larger than the other. For every single rotation both wheels make, the larger wheel covers more ground. It travels a greater distance. In essence, the larger left side tires on Petty's Pontiac were traveling slightly farther than the right side tires for each identical revolution. This created a natural, built-in tendency for the car to rotate to the left. The car wanted to turn left. It was biased toward turning left simply because of the difference in tire circumference from one side to the other. Now, you might be thinking, so what? The car turns left a little easier. But the implications are profound. This natural rotation tendency reduced the steering input needed from the driver and dramatically decreased the load on the front tires. Less steering input means less scrub, less drag from the front tires fighting against the direction of travel. Less front tire load means those front tires last longer, maintain their grip window longer, and provide more consistent feedback to the driver throughout a long fuel run. The car became more stable and more predictable through corners, which meant the driver could carry more speed with more confidence. And in racing, confidence is speed. That is not a metaphor. It is a literal, measurable fact. There was also a subtle but significant aerodynamic benefit that most people completely overlook when they discuss the scandal. The slightly taller left side tires raised that side of the car just enough to alter the airflow pattern underneath the chassis. In NASCAR, where right height is strictly regulated down to fractions of an inch, gaining even the smallest amount of additional clearance without triggering an inspection failure is incredibly valuable. The raised left side improved the car's rake angle, which is the difference in right height between the front and rear of the car. A properly optimized rake angle reduces aerodynamic drag on the straightaways while maintaining or even increasing downforce through the corners. Petty's car was effectively running a different aerodynamic configuration than every other car in the field, and nobody could see it because the difference was hidden in the tires, not in the bodywork. But the real magic, the advantage that compounded every other benefit, happens with heat management. Racing tires operate in a very specific temperature window where they provide maximum grip. Too cold and the rubber is hard and slippery, unable to conform to the microscopic texture of the track surface. Too hot and the rubber begins to break down, blistering and chunking as the chemical bonds in the compound start to fail. Every team in NASCAR struggled with this balance. Track temperatures change throughout a race as the sun moves across the sky. Fuel load decreases, changing the weight on the tires. Traffic patterns affect airflow and cooling. Managing tire temperatures across a full race distance was one of the most challenging aspects of competition. The oversized left side tires had more mass and more surface area than their legal counterparts. This additional material allowed them to absorb and dissipate heat more effectively, acting almost like a larger heat sink compared to standard tires. While other teams were watching their left side tires overheat and lose grip in the final 20 laps of a fuel run, Petty's illegal rubber maintained its optimal operating temperature for significantly longer. Testing conducted after the scandal was exposed showed that the larger tires could maintain their peak grip window for 15 to 20% longer than standard specification tires under identical conditions. Over the course of a 500-mile race with multiple long green flag runs, that advantage was absolutely devastating. The psychological dimension of this scheme was equally powerful, though it is rarely discussed in technical analyses. Richard Petty and his team knew they had an edge. They knew with absolute certainty that their car had capabilities that no other car in the field possessed. That knowledge, that confidence, translates directly to on-track performance in ways that are difficult to quantify but impossible to deny. Petty could push harder in qualifying, trusting that the tires would stick when he needed them to. He could be more aggressive in race traffic, confident that the extra grip would get him through tight three-wide situations that other drivers would shy away from. He could run deeper into corners, brake later, get on the throttle earlier, because he knew, deep in his bones, that those left-side tires had more to give than anyone else's. For several races during the 1983 season, the trick worked with flawless, almost eerie perfection. Petty's team was consistently competitive, running speeds that were just fast enough to be impressive but not so fast as to raise immediate suspicion. The car passed pre-race technical inspection without incident. It passed post-race inspection without a single flag. It survived random spot checks during race weekends. NASCAR officials examined it, poked at it, crawled under it, and found nothing. Other teams looked at the 43 car with suspicion, as teams always look at fast competitors, but nobody could identify anything specific. It was, by every measure, the perfect crime. Look, here is the thing that makes this story so much more complicated and so much more fascinating than a simple tale of cheating. The oversized tires were not the only illegal modification on Petty's car, not by a long shot. At the same time the team was running bigger left-side rubber, they were simultaneously executing another trick that would become equally infamous in NASCAR lore. They had developed a system of illegal fuel additives hidden inside hollow frame rails within the car's roll cage structure. The frame rail scheme was almost comically elaborate compared to the elegant simplicity of the tire modification. The team had carefully modified the car's roll cage and chassis frame rails to create hidden compartments within the structural tubing. These compartments were filled with specially formulated fuel additives, chemical compounds designed to increase the effective octane rating of the race fuel. During the race, as the car vibrated and flexed through corners and over bumps, these additives would slowly leak from their hidden compartments into the main fuel system through carefully engineered pathways that look like normal welds and joints to any inspector who was not specifically looking for them. The result was that Petty's engine was effectively running on fuel with a higher octane rating than anyone else in the field. Higher octane fuel allows for more aggressive ignition timing without the risk of detonation, which is the uncontrolled explosion of the fuel-air mixture that can destroy an engine in milliseconds. More aggressive timing meant more complete combustion, which meant more horsepower extracted from every drop of fuel. Conservative estimates suggested the fuel advantage alone was worth somewhere between 15 and 25 additional horsepower, a meaningful number in an era when total engine output was typically in the 500 to 550 horsepower range. Now, here is the beautiful irony that makes this entire story so compelling. It was actually the fuel system modification, not the tires, that led to the unraveling of the entire scheme. During a particularly thorough post-race technical inspection at Charlotte Motor Speedway, NASCAR officials discovered evidence of the illegal fuel delivery system. Something did not add up in the fuel sample analysis, or perhaps a sharp-eyed inspector noticed something unusual about the frame rail construction. The exact trigger for the deeper investigation varies depending on who tells a story, but the result was the same. Once NASCAR officials found one violation, they decided to tear the entire car apart and check absolutely everything. Every measurement, every specification, every component that could possibly be outside the rules. That is when they discovered the left side tires were 4 inches too large in circumference. The inspector who made the discovery later described measuring the tires 3 separate times because he could not believe what his tape measure was telling him. The circumference was so consistently oversized, so precisely manufactured to be exactly 4 inches larger than specification, that he initially thought his measuring equipment was faulty or that he was making an error in his methodology. Only after confirming with multiple measuring tools and having a second inspector independently verify the readings did he realize he had uncovered one of the most significant cheating scandals in NASCAR's storied history.
NASCAR's reaction was swift, decisive, and brutal. The fine of $35,000 was an enormous sum for 1983. To put that in perspective, adjusted for inflation, that is equivalent to roughly $100,000 in today's money. Some smaller teams in the NASCAR garage operated on total annual budgets that were not dramatically larger than that single fine. But the financial penalty, as painful as it was, paled in comparison to the competitive damage of the points penalty. 104 championship points stripped from Petty's season total essentially destroyed any chance the team had of competing for the Cup championship that year. It was one of the harshest penalties NASCAR had ever levied against any competitor, and it sent an unmistakable message to every team in the garage. The era of blatant, brazen rule-breaking was over, or at least it was going to cost you dearly if you got caught. The racing world absolutely exploded with controversy. The reaction split along predictable but fascinating lines. One camp saw the penalty as justice, long overdue accountability finally catching up with a team that had been bending, stretching, and occasionally snapping rules for years. They pointed to the elaborate nature of the schemes, both the tires and the fuel system, as evidence that this was not a one-time lapse in judgment, but a systematic, deliberate program of cheating that undermined the competitive integrity of the entire sport. The other camp, equally vocal and equally passionate, argued that creative interpretation of the rules was woven into NASCAR's very DNA, that it was as much a part of the sport's identity as the checkered flag and the victory lap. They contended that Petty was being punished not for cheating, but for being too successful at a game that every single team in the garage was playing. The only difference, they argued, was that Petty's team was better at it than everyone else. Draw the line wherever you want, they said, but do not pretend that anyone in this garage is running a completely legal car. Petty himself maintained a dignified silence in the immediate aftermath, choosing not to publicly defend the modifications or attack NASCAR's decision. But years later, in interviews and casual conversations at industry events, he admitted with characteristic candor that his teams had always pushed the boundaries of what the rules allowed. He was diplomatic about it, as Petty usually was, framing it less as cheating and more as competitive innovation, taken perhaps a step too far. But the message was clear. Everyone was doing it. His team simply got caught. The mechanic who masterminded the oversized tire trick became something of a folk hero in NASCAR garages across the country. Here was a man who had outsmarted the entire sanctioning body, every inspector, every competitor, every engineer in the paddock with something so elegantly simple it bordered on genius. No complex engineering solutions requiring advanced degrees in material science, no exotic technology smuggled in from aerospace programs or military research. Just 4 inches of extra rubber applied with surgical precision to exploit a blind spot that nobody even knew existed. The immediate impact on NASCAR's technical regulations was profound and far-reaching. Within weeks of the scandal becoming public, the sanctioning body implemented a comprehensive slate of new inspection procedures, specifically targeting tire measurements. They started measuring rolling circumference, not just static tire dimensions like width and sidewall height. They began marking individual tires with unique identifiers before races and checking those exact same marked tires afterward to ensure no substitutions had been made. They developed specialized templates and precision gauges designed specifically to catch oversized tires, instruments that could detect variations of less than a quarter inch in circumference. The days of eyeballing tire sizes were over, permanently.
But the bigger transformation was philosophical rather than procedural. NASCAR's leadership realized, perhaps for the first time with painful clarity, that teams would exploit any ambiguity, any gap, any blind spot in the inspection process, no matter how small or seemingly insignificant. The rulebook underwent a fundamental restructuring. What had previously been gentlemen's agreements and general guidelines became ironclad, hyper-specific regulations with clearly defined penalties attached to each individual violation. The document grew thicker, denser, more detailed with every passing season. Other teams, meanwhile, drew completely different lessons from the scandal. Their reasoning was simple and devastating in its logic. If Petty's crew could run oversized tires for multiple consecutive races without detection, passing every inspection thrown at them, what else was possible? What other blind spots existed in NASCAR's inspection process? What other simple, elegant modifications could provide a competitive advantage while evading detection? The incident did not discourage cheating. It inspired an entirely new generation of creative cheating. Teams began investing more resources than ever into finding loopholes, hiring engineers specifically tasked with interpreting rules creatively, and developing modifications that could pass inspection while providing advantages that the rule writers never imagined. The technical evolution that followed was genuinely fascinating to track. Teams immediately started experimenting with tire pressures that would change dynamically during races as the tires heated up from friction with the track surface. They developed special valve stems engineered to release pressure at carefully calibrated rates, allowing the tire to start a run at one pressure and gradually transition to a lower, more advantageous pressure as the rubber reached its optimal operating temperature. They even experimented with tire compounds that would change their grip characteristics as the rubber wore down, becoming stickier in the middle of a run when the car was lightest on fuel and the track was hottest. None of these innovations were as simple or as devastatingly effective as just making the tires 4 inches bigger, but they demonstrated how one elegant trick had blown open the floodgates of creative tire engineering. The oversized tire incident also fundamentally changed how teams approached vehicle dynamics as a discipline. If 4 inches of tire circumference could make that dramatic a difference in lap times and race performance, what about weight distribution? What about suspension geometry and the dozens of adjustable parameters hidden within it? What about the hundreds of small aerodynamic details that inspectors might overlook because they were focused on the big, obvious things? Suddenly, every single aspect of the race car was fair game for creative interpretation. Nothing was too small to optimize, too insignificant to examine, too mundane to modify. Engine builders across the garage took notice as well, and their conclusions were troubling for NASCAR's enforcement apparatus. If Petty's team was willing to hide fuel additives inside hollow frame rails and run custom-manufactured oversized tires, what modifications might be lurking inside the engines themselves that nobody had caught? Competitors began demanding more thorough, more invasive engine inspections. This grassroots pressure from the teams themselves eventually led to the development of NASCAR's current system, where engines are randomly confiscated after races for complete tear-down inspections conducted by independent engineers at NASCAR's Research and Development Center. The safety implications of the oversized tire scandal were sobering and demanded serious consideration. Oversized tires change a car's handling characteristics in ways that might not be entirely predictable, especially in failure modes. If one of those oversized left side tires failed catastrophically at speed, blowing out on the backstretch at 180 miles per hour, the car would behave differently than engineers and safety designers expected. The handling response to a blowout is partially determined by the tire's dimensions, and the tire that is 4 inches out of specification throws all those calculations into uncertainty. NASCAR had to consider not just competitive fairness and sportsmanship, but the fundamental safety of every driver on the track. This concern led to the development of more stringent tire testing and certification protocols, and the requirement that teams use only NASCAR-approved tires with specific serial numbers that could be tracked from the Goodyear manufacturing facility all the way to the disposal bin after the race. From a pure engineering perspective, divorced from any questions of ethics or sportsmanship, the oversized tire trick was elegant in its simplicity in a way that would make any engineer smile with grudging admiration. No modern electronics, no exotic composite materials, no complex computational analysis, just the basic intuitive understanding of physics, specifically the relationship between contact patch area and grip force, combined with the audacity and the nerve to act on that understanding when everyone else assumed tires were an area where you could not gain an advantage. The mechanic had identified a fundamental truth about oval track racing and exploited it with minimal risk of mechanical failure. The oversized tires were not stressed beyond their design parameters. They were not weakened or compromised in any way. They were simply larger, and that simple difference changed everything. The grip improvement from those 4 extra inches was both measurable and significant when subjected to rigorous post-scandal analysis. Testing conducted by NASCAR and independent engineers after the scheme was exposed showed that the oversized left side tires could improve cornering speeds by 2 to 3 miles per hour under optimal conditions. Now, 2 to 3 miles per hour might not sound dramatic in everyday driving terms, but in racing, where the difference between first place and 10th place can be measured in tenths of a second per lap, that speed increase is transformative. Over the course of a 500-mile race consisting of hundreds of laps, that cornering speed advantage compounds into a total time difference measured in full seconds. That is the difference between winning convincingly and finishing deep in the field. The heat management benefits were equally impressive when quantified. As I mentioned earlier, the larger tires could maintain their optimal operating temperature for 15 to 20% longer than standard specification tires under identical test conditions. In the early 1980s, before the development of specialized tire compounds tailored to individual tracks, this advantage was particularly devastating on a brace of track surfaces that chewed through standard tires aggressively. Tracks like Darlington, Bristol, and North Wilkesboro were notorious for destroying left-side tires. The extra rubber mass and surface area of the oversized tires provided a thermal buffer that kept them in their grip window when everyone else's tires were starting to slide. But perhaps the most impressive aspect of the entire scheme, the element that truly elevates it from simple cheating to something approaching criminal genius, was the detection avoidance strategy. The mechanic had identified a specific blind spot in NASCAR's inspection process and exploited it with surgical precision. The tires looked right to visual inspection. They felt right when you squeezed the sidewall. They even measured right under the standard dimensional checks that NASCAR performed, because inspectors were measuring width, sidewall height, and tread depth, not rolling circumference. Nobody wrapped a tape measure around the outside of the tire because nobody thought anyone would modify that particular dimension. It was a masterclass in understanding not just the technical rules themselves, but how those rules were actually enforced in practice, and finding the gap between the two. The scandal also pulled back the curtain on the complex, sometimes uncomfortable relationship between tire manufacturers, racing teams, and the sanctioning body. Goodyear, as NASCAR's sole tire supplier, found itself in an extraordinarily awkward position. The company officially claimed absolutely no knowledge of the specially manufactured oversized tires, but somebody had to make them. You cannot produce a racing tire with precisely controlled dimensions using home workshop equipment. The manufacturing process requires industrial molds, specialized curing ovens, quality control instrumentation, and deep expertise in rubber chemistry. Either someone within Goodyear's racing division was complicit in producing the oversized tires, or the team had access to tire manufacturing capabilities that rivaled those of a major industrial supplier. Neither explanation was particularly comfortable for anyone involved. The scandal led directly to new protocols governing tire production, distribution, inventory control, and chain of custody tracking that persists in modified form to this day. The financial ramifications extended well beyond the $35,000 fine. Sponsors were deeply unhappy about being associated with a cheating scandal, even though privately many corporate representatives understood that pushing boundaries was part of NASCAR's competitive culture. In 1983, NASCAR was in the midst of a significant transition from regional entertainment to national big business. Television contracts were growing, corporate sponsorship dollars were increasing. The sport was attracting attention from Fortune 500 companies who demanded a certain level of professional integrity from their marketing partners. Petty's team had to navigate extremely delicate conversations with corporate sponsors about the difference between competitive innovation and outright cheating. It was an uncomfortable reminder that the outlaw spirit that had built NASCAR could also threaten its commercial future. The media coverage was intense and sustained. This was 1983, years before the internet, before 24-hour sports news networks, before social media could amplify every rumor and opinion to millions of people instantaneously. But even within the limitations of print media and weekly racing publications, the oversized tire story dominated coverage for months. Every racing magazine in the country ran detailed analyses. Newspaper sports sections picked up the story. Even mainstream media outlets covered it as a quirky, colorful tale from the world of stock car racing. Everyone wanted to know the same things. How exactly was it done? Who knew about it? How long had it been going on? And most tantalizingly, what other secrets might be hidden in NASCAR garages across the country? Fellow drivers had mixed and often contradictory reactions. Some were genuinely outraged that Petty, the king, the man who was supposed to represent everything good about the sport, had been racing with illegal modifications while they were competing with legal equipment. These drivers felt personally cheated, robbed of positions and prize money they might have earned if the playing field had been level. Others, often the more experienced veterans who had been around the garage long enough to understand its culture, admired the creativity and wished their own teams had thought of it first. The incident reinforced an existing divide in the driver community between those who saw themselves as pure racers competing on talent alone and those who understood that NASCAR had always been as much about engineering, innovation, and creative problem solving as it was about driving skill. The legacy of the oversized tire scandal extends far beyond the borders of NASCAR. Other racing series around the world took careful notice of the incident and preemptively tightened their own inspection procedures to prevent similar exploits. The FIA, the governing body that oversees Formula One and dozens of other international racing categories, specifically referenced the Petty tire scandal in internal communications when updating their own tire regulations. Even drag racing sanctioning bodies and sports car racing organizations reviewed and revised their rules to ensure that tire dimensions were being verified with sufficient rigor. One mechanic's trick in a stock car garage in North Carolina had rippled outward to affect the regulatory framework of motorsports globally. In the decades since 1983, the story has evolved from current events into full-blown NASCAR folklore. It is told and retold in garages across the country as both a cautionary tale and an inspirational legend, sometimes simultaneously. Young mechanics entering the sport hear about it and dream of finding their own 4-inch advantage, their own elegant exploit that nobody else has thought of. Veteran crew chiefs reference it when explaining to newcomers why certain seemingly arbitrary rules exist and why inspectors measure things that appear insignificant. The technical documentation generated during the investigation has become genuine study material in motorsports engineering programs at universities that offer such curricula. How did the team manufacture the tires while maintaining quality and consistency? How did they coordinate the logistics of storing, transporting, and mounting illegal tires without any team member leaking information to competitors or officials? These questions are examined as case studies in project management and organizational security as much as in engineering and physics. Here is what most people do not realize about the modern state of NASCAR tire control. Today's sanctioning body has implemented a system that would make those 1983 oversized tires impossible to run for even a single lap. Contemporary NASCAR tires have radio frequency identification chips embedded directly into the rubber during manufacturing. Each tire is assigned a unique electronic identity that is registered in a central database and tracked from the moment it leaves the Goodyear production facility to the moment it is mounted on a car, used in competition, and ultimately disposed of. Laser measurement systems deployed during inspections can detect dimensional variations of less than 1 millimeter, a fraction of the size of those 4 infamous inches. Rolling circumference is checked multiple times during a race weekend, not just before or after the main event. The chain of custody for every single tire is documented and auditable. The system is, for all practical purposes, impossible to defeat with the kind of simple dimensional modification that worked so brilliantly 4 decades ago. But the spirit of innovation that drove the creation of those oversized tires lives on in every NASCAR garage, in every engineering office, in every late-night brainstorming session where crew chiefs and engineers search for the next competitive edge. The methods have changed dramatically, but the underlying motivation is identical. Teams now focus their creative energy on areas that are inherently more difficult to police and inspect. They invest millions of dollars in computational fluid dynamics to discover aerodynamic advantages that only manifest at specific speeds and yaw angles. They develop proprietary simulation software that can model hundreds of setup variables simultaneously, finding optimizations that would take decades to discover through physical testing alone. They push boundaries in material science, in manufacturing tolerances, in data analysis methodologies. The game continues relentlessly, just with different rules, different tools, and different vulnerabilities to exploit. The human element of this story is frequently overlooked in favor of the technical details, and that is a shame because it is arguably the most compelling dimension of the entire saga. The mechanic who developed the oversized tire concept was not some cartoonish villain attempting to destroy NASCAR's competitive integrity for personal gain. He was a racer, a competitor, a craftsman who spent his life turning wrenches, studying tire wear patterns, observing how cars behaved in corners, and absorbing the subtle feedback that experienced drivers communicated about their machines. He was trying to win using every tool, every insight, every advantage at his disposal, which is exactly what every competitor in the history of organized sport has tried to do since the first race was run. In interviews conducted years and decades after the scandal, team members described the atmosphere inside the shop during those weeks of running the illegal tires as electric. There was a shared sense of purpose, a collective energy that came from knowing they had discovered something that nobody else had. Everyone worked harder, everyone pushed further, everyone believed more deeply in what they were doing. The secret bonded them together and drove their performance to levels that surprised even themselves. But the pressure must have been absolutely immense. Every pre-race inspection was a potential catastrophe. Every interaction with a NASCAR official carried the risk of discovery. Every time an inspector knelt beside the car and examined the tire, hearts must have stopped beating for a moment. Every victory was celebrated publicly, but privately shadowed by the knowledge that it could be taken away, that the championship points earned today could be stripped tomorrow. Living with that secret across multiple race weekends took a psychological toll on everyone involved that is difficult to fully appreciate from the outside. Richard Petty himself emerged from the scandal with his reputation remarkably, almost inexplicably intact. The king had accumulated such an enormous reservoir of goodwill through his genuine kindness to fans, his ambassadorship for the sport, and his undeniable talent behind the wheel that the public was willing to separate the team's actions from his personal legacy. The scandal added complexity and nuance to his story, but it did not diminish his stature. He was not merely a great driver. He was a complete competitor who understood that success in NASCAR required excellence in every dimension, from driving skill to mechanical preparation to strategic risk-taking, even when that risk-taking crossed lines that the sanctioning body had drawn. The competitive advantage those 4 inches provided deserves one final comprehensive accounting because the numbers are genuinely staggering when you add them all up. In qualifying, the extra grip from the increased contact patch and the improved handling balance could translate to 2 or 3 grid positions. Starting 5th instead of 8th means cleaner air, fewer cars to pass, less risk of being caught up in someone else's mistake. In race conditions, the heat management advantage meant the ability to run harder for longer without suffering tire degradation, gaining time on competitors during the critical final laps of fuel runs when everyone else's tires were falling off. In traffic, the improved handling balance provided the confidence and the mechanical capability to make aggressive passing moves, to run 3 wide through corners that other drivers would approach with more caution, to exploit gaps that existed for only fractions of a second. Every single aspect of competitive performance improved with those 4 inches of additional tire circumference. Speed, consistency, confidence, heat management, handling balance, aerodynamic efficiency. When you add all of those marginal gains together, you do not get a marginal advantage, you get a transformative one. The penalty announcement sent shockwaves through every level of stock car racing. $35,000 exceeded what some smaller independent teams spent in an entire season. 104 championship points was enough to transform a legitimate title contender into a mid-pack afterthought in the final standings. NASCAR was making an unmistakable statement to every team owner, every crew chief, every mechanic in every garage across the country. There would be consequences. Real consequences. The price of getting caught would hurt badly enough to make even the most aggressive innovators think twice. But the innovation never stopped. It never could. Within months of the tire scandal, teams were already developing the next generation of creative rule exploitation. Adjustable aerodynamic devices that would subtly change shape at racing speeds, providing additional downforce in corners while reducing drag on straightaways. Brake cooling systems ingeniously designed to serve double duty as aerodynamic elements, generating downforce from components that inspectors categorized as cooling hardware rather than bodywork. Suspension systems with hidden adjustability that could be modified during pit stops in ways that were technically legal but clearly outside the spirit of the regulations. The arms race did not pause for even a moment. The oversized tire scandal also fundamentally influenced how NASCAR drafted future regulations. Instead of writing rules that said tires must be approximately a certain size, officials began specifying exact Goodyear part numbers, manufacturing date ranges, and individual serial numbers. They moved from principles-based regulation to specifications-based regulation, from describing what they wanted to prescribing exactly what was permitted. The rulebook became less a philosophical document about fair competition and more a technical manual listing thousands of specific components and allowable tolerances. This transformation was a direct, traceable consequence of the creativity teams demonstrated when given even the smallest amount of interpretive freedom. Today, NASCAR teams employ dozens of engineers with advanced degrees in aerospace, mechanical, and material science. They spend millions annually on wind tunnel testing, computational simulation, and 7-post shake rigs that can simulate an entire race worth of road surface inputs in a laboratory environment. The tools have changed beyond recognition since 1983. But every single one of those engineers, every crew chief, every mechanic, is still chasing exactly the same thing that anonymous tire innovator was pursuing 4 decades ago: an advantage, an edge. Those crucial 4 inches, in whatever form they might take today, that separate winning from merely competing. The oversized tire story reminds us that racing has always been about far more than just driving. It is about innovation, creativity, lateral thinking, and the relentless, obsessive, never-satisfied pursuit of speed in all its forms. It is about finding advantages where others see only limitations. It is about pushing boundaries, sometimes carefully, sometimes recklessly, and occasionally right past their breaking point. Modern tire technology has evolved so far beyond what existed in 1983 that the two eras might as well be different sports. Today's racing tires are precision manufactured to tolerances measured in fractions of millimeters, with specific compounds engineered for individual tracks, weather conditions, even time of day. But the fundamental physics that made those oversized tires so effective have not changed one bit. The grip equation is eternal. More contact patch equals more grip. Better heat management equals more consistent performance over longer runs. Optimal tire dimensions equal faster, more predictable lap times. The mechanic who figured out how to add 4 inches to tire circumference understood these principles at an intuitive level that transcended formal education. That knowledge, that deep, practical understanding of how things really work, as opposed to how textbooks say they should work, cannot be taught in any engineering program. It comes from years of turning wrenches, from watching tires wear across thousands of laps, from feeling the difference between a car that is hooked up and one that is pushing, from absorbing and interpreting the subtle, sometimes contradictory feedback that experienced drivers provide about their machines. It is the difference between theoretical knowledge and hard-won practical wisdom, and it is what has always separated the truly great mechanics and engineers from merely competent ones. Looking back more than 40 years later, the audacity of the scheme still impresses, still surprises, still makes you shake your head and smile. In an era of increasing scrutiny and ever more detailed regulations, one mechanic looked at the problem of going faster and decided that the solution was the simplest thing imaginable. Just make the tires bigger. And for a brief, spectacular, glorious stretch of races, it worked absolutely perfectly. That is the enduring beauty of racing innovation. Sometimes the simplest ideas carry the most devastating power. The legacy lives on in every garage, every engineering meeting, every rules discussion, every late-night argument about where innovation ends and cheating begins. When teams push boundaries today, whether they know it or not, they are following in the footsteps of that mechanic who dared to add 4 inches. When officials write new regulations, they are trying to prevent the next version of that scheme. The dance between innovation and regulation continues, forever shaped by those oversized tires on a 43 Pontiac in 1983. What engineering innovation or racing scandal fascinates you the most? Drop a comment below and share your thoughts on whether creative rule interpretation is cheating or simply part of the game. Do not forget to subscribe for more stories of automotive innovation, engineering brilliance, and the relentless pursuit of speed that defines everything we love about motorsports.
What if I told you that NASCAR mechanics once figured out how to cram 2 extra gallons of fuel into a regulation tank without changing a single bolt, welding a single seam, or modifying a single component? No trick fuel cells, no hidden compartments, no illegal plumbing, just pure, calculated physics that bent the rulebook so hard that NASCAR officials had to scramble to rewrite it before the trick changed the sport forever. Picture this for a second. It is the mid-1960s. You are standing in the garage area at Daytona International Speedway. The Florida humidity is pressing down on you like a wet blanket. The air is thick with the sharp bite of high-octane racing fuel and the acrid sweetness of burning rubber. Somewhere behind you, an engine fires up on a dyno, and the whole building vibrates in your chest. Teams are preparing for the Daytona 500, a 500-mile war of attrition where every single pit stop could mean the difference between hoisting that trophy overhead or packing up the hauler in silence and driving home with nothing. The best pit crews in the business could change 4 tires and dump 22 gallons of fuel in under 20 seconds. That was world class. That was the standard. But what if you could eliminate an entire pit stop? What if you never had to make that last stop at all? What if you could stay out on the track while your rivals ducked onto pit road, losing 30 seconds, losing track position, losing momentum, losing the race? This is the story of how one brilliant, resourceful mechanic discovered a loophole hidden not in the NASCAR rulebook, but in the laws of physics themselves. A trick so simple, so elegant, and so devastatingly effective that when officials finally caught on, they had no idea how to stop it. We are talking about the infamous fuel freezing technique, a scheme that turned basic chemistry into a competitive weapon and made NASCAR officials lose sleep over thermometers of all things. This is legacy motoring, and I spend way too much time thinking about the insane ways racing teams have bent the rules of physics to find speed. If you are someone who loves digging into the wild engineering tricks and mechanical loopholes that shaped motorsport history, make sure to hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up if this helps you out. Now, to understand why freezing fuel was such an absolute game changer, we need to travel back to what I like to call NASCAR's Wild West era. And look, I do not use that term lightly. This was genuinely a time when the phrase stock car was more of a polite suggestion than an actual rule. The 1960s NASCAR circuit was a proving ground where innovation was not just encouraged, it was required for survival. Teams were running cars that pushed 180 miles per hour on the high-banked superspeedways of Daytona and Talladega, burning through fuel at rates that would make a modern hybrid owner pass out cold. The competition was absolutely brutal. Ford, Chrysler, and General Motors were locked in an all-out manufacturer war for supremacy, and they were spending money like it was going out of style. Factory-backed teams had virtually unlimited budgets. They had engineers from Detroit flying down every weekend. They had resources that would make some Formula One teams jealous. Meanwhile, the independent teams, the privateers, the guys who mortgaged their houses to go racing, they survived on one thing and one thing only: ingenuity. Raw, desperate, brilliant ingenuity.
Here is the thing about the rulebook back then. It was thinner than a diner menu, and if something was not explicitly written down as illegal, well, it was fair game. That was the unwritten code. If the inspectors could not find it, it did not exist. If the rulebook did not mention it, it was not cheating. This was the environment, this pressure cooker of creativity and competition, that bred the kind of thinking that would eventually lead to the fuel-freezing revolution. Racing in this era was about pushing every single boundary you could find. Teams would acid dip body panels to dissolve metal and make them thinner and lighter. They would bore out engine blocks until the cylinder walls were practically paper thin, squeezing every last cubic inch of displacement they could get. They would subtly reshape aerodynamic components, shaving a quarter-inch here, adding a curve there, and then mysteriously reshape them back to stock specifications right before the inspectors came around. Crew chiefs kept their real tricks hidden in plain sight. But fuel capacity? That was supposed to be the one thing you could not touch. NASCAR mandated a maximum 22-gallon fuel cell for superspeedway races. No exceptions, no modifications, no negotiations. The fuel cell was the fuel cell. You got 22 gallons and that was that. End of discussion. Except it was not the end of the discussion. Not even close. Because the problem that fuel capacity created was simple to understand, but devastating in its implications. At superspeedway races like Daytona and Talladega, cars were running wide open throttle for virtually the entire 500 miles. There was no lifting, there was no coasting. You had your foot buried in the floorboard from the green flag to the checkered flag. And if you did not, the guy behind you certainly did, and he was going to blow right past you. The big block V8 engines of that era were magnificent, awe-inspiring beasts of American engineering, but they were absolutely terrible on fuel economy. A typical NASCAR engine of the late 1960s displaced 427 cubic inches. It ran compression ratios around 12:1. It produced north of 500 horsepower. And at full throttle, wide open, screaming down the backstretch at Daytona, these engines consumed fuel at a rate of about 5 miles per gallon. Sometimes less, sometimes a lot less. Do the math with me here. 500 miles of racing at 5 miles per gallon means you need 100 gallons of fuel to finish the race. With a 22-gallon tank, that means a minimum of 4 pit stops just for fuel. And that is assuming you could run the tank bone dry every single time, which you absolutely could not. In reality, teams were stopping 5 times, sometimes 6. Each stop cost at least 30 seconds under green flag conditions. When you add it all up, that's 2.5 to 3 full minutes spent sitting completely still on pit road while your competition is out there doing 180 miles per hour. 3 minutes. In a sport where championships were decided by car lengths, 3 minutes was an eternity. But here's where it gets really interesting. Some genius mechanic, and I wish I could tell you exactly who it was because this person deserves a statue, but their identity has been lost to the fog of racing history. Though, believe me, plenty of people have claimed credit over the years. This unknown genius realized something fundamental about the physics of liquids, something that every chemistry student learns in their first semester, but that nobody in racing had ever thought to exploit. Fuel, like all liquids, contracts when it gets cold. The colder the fuel gets, the denser it becomes. And the denser it becomes, the more mass you can physically fit into the same volume of space. It was beautiful in its simplicity. It was elegant. It was the kind of idea that makes you slap your forehead and say, why did nobody think of this before?
Gasoline has a coefficient of thermal expansion of approximately 0.095% per degree Celsius. Now, I know that does not sound like much. It sounds like a rounding error. It sounds like the kind of number you ignore on a test. But let me break down what that number actually means in real-world racing terms, because this is where the magic happens. At 70 degrees Fahrenheit, which is a typical race day temperature in Daytona, 22 gallons of fuel takes up exactly 22 gallons of space inside that fuel cell. Obvious, right? That is just how volume works. But now cool that same fuel down to 30 degrees Fahrenheit, just barely above freezing, and something genuinely magical happens. The fuel contracts. It physically shrinks. Those same 22 gallons of fuel mass now occupy only about 21.5 gallons of space. That means you can pour another half gallon of fuel into the tank, bring it right back up to the 22-gallon line, and when inspectors measure the volume, everything checks out perfectly. You're illegal. The tank holds 22 gallons. Nobody said anything about how much those 22 gallons weigh. But why stop at 30 degrees? Here's what most people do not realize. The teams did not stop at just barely above freezing. That was amateur hour. The really serious operations discovered they could cool the fuel even further using a combination of dry ice baths and alcohol solutions. Dry ice, which is solid carbon dioxide, has a surface temperature of -109 degrees Fahrenheit. Submerge your fuel containers in a bath of alcohol and dry ice, and you can bring fuel temperatures down to near 0 degrees Fahrenheit without the fuel itself freezing. Gasoline does not freeze until somewhere around -40 to -50 degrees, depending on the blend. So there was a massive window of opportunity here. At these extreme temperatures, the contraction was dramatically more pronounced. Some crew chiefs, the ones who really understood the science, claimed they could squeeze an extra 1.5 to 2 full gallons into a regulation 22-gallon fuel cell. Let that sink in for a moment. 2 extra gallons. That is nearly a 10% increase in fuel capacity without touching, modifying, or altering the fuel tank in any way. The tank passed every inspection. It measured exactly 22 gallons, but it was carrying 24 gallons of fuel mass. The physics was bulletproof. The execution, though, that was an art form all its own. Teams would store their fuel in refrigerated box trucks, the same kind you would use to transport frozen food, keeping the fuel as cold as humanly possible right up until the last possible moment. Some crews used modified commercial beer coolers packed to the brim with dry ice. Others built elaborate custom cooling systems that circulated industrial refrigerant around insulated fuel containers, maintaining precise temperatures for hours on end. The most sophisticated operations, the ones with factory backing and real budgets, had purpose-built temperature-controlled fuel storage units that could hold fuel at a specific temperature within a degree or two of their target. On race day, the ballet would begin. And I call it a ballet because the choreography was just as precise, just as rehearsed, and just as beautiful in its execution. Fuel would be transferred from the refrigerated storage to the dump cans just minutes before a scheduled pit stop.
Timing was everything. Too early and the fuel would start warming up, expanding, and you would lose your advantage. Too late, and you risked not having the cans ready when the car hit pit road. The dump cans themselves were sometimes pre-cooled with blasts of liquid nitrogen, getting the metal so cold that it would maintain the fuel temperature for those critical few minutes. Crew members wore thick insulated gloves, not just for the standard safety reasons you might expect, but because the metal fuel cans were so brutally cold that bare skin contact could cause instant frostbite. If you grabbed one of those cans without gloves, you were going to the infield care center, not victory lane. And here is a detail I love. You could actually see it happening if you knew what to look for.
In the humid southern air of Daytona and Darlington and Talladega, condensation would form on the outside of these supercooled fuel cans almost instantly. Moisture from the air would bead up on the cold metal surface and then freeze into a thin layer of frost, exactly like a cold beer on a hot summer day. If you were standing on pit road and you saw frost forming on a team's fuel cans, you knew exactly what they were up to. Now, you might be thinking, okay, so you get a couple extra gallons. Is that really worth all this trouble? And the answer is absolutely, unequivocally, 100% yes. But the advantages went even beyond the extra volume. The physics did not stop at just fitting more fuel into the tank. Cold fuel had other performance benefits that sharp teams were incredibly quick to exploit. When supercooled fuel enters a hot engine, and we are talking about an engine where the intake manifold might be 200 degrees and the combustion chamber is seeing temperatures north of 1,000 degrees, that cold fuel absorbs heat from its surroundings. It acts like a chemical intercooler. This cooling effect increases the density of the air-fuel mixture entering the cylinders, which means more oxygen molecules packed into each combustion event, which potentially allows for more aggressive ignition timing and slightly more power output. Now, we're not talking about 50 extra horsepower here. We're talking about maybe 5 to 10 extra horsepower at best. But I need you to understand something about superspeedway racing in the 1960s. These cars were drafting in packs, nose to tail, at 180 miles per hour. Races were decided by inches, literally inches. The 1960 Daytona 500 was famously decided by a margin so small that photographs had to be examined for hours to determine the winner. In that environment, 5 extra horsepower was not trivial. It was the difference between pulling away from the draft and getting swallowed by the pack. Cold fuel also vaporized differently in the carburetor. The carburetor jets and metering circuits that were perfectly calibrated for 70-degree fuel would behave differently when suddenly fed fuel that was near 0 degrees. The cold fuel was denser, heavier, and less volatile. It did not atomize as easily. This meant the engine would run slightly richer than intended, more fuel in the mixture relative to air. Some crew chiefs looked at this and saw a problem. They worried about fouled spark plugs and incomplete combustion. But the smarter ones, the ones who were thinking 3 moves ahead, saw it as an opportunity. By intentionally running cold fuel with specifically recalibrated carburetors, jets drilled out to slightly different sizes, metering rods adjusted to compensate, they could create a deliberately richer mixture that provided better internal cooling for the engine under extreme sustained stress. At wide-open throttle for 500 miles, engine temperatures were the enemy. A richer mixture runs cooler. A cooler engine lasts longer, and the car that finishes the race beats a car that blows up on lap 400 every single time. This could literally mean the difference between an engine surviving the full 500 miles and detonating spectacularly on the backstretch with 20 laps to go. The strategic implications of all of this combined were absolutely staggering. Let me walk you through a typical 500-mile superspeedway race of that era to show you what I mean. With standard fuel temperature and the regulation 22-gallon capacity, a car burning fuel at 5 miles per gallon could cover roughly 100 to 110 miles on a full tank. That meant a minimum of 5 pit stops over the course of the race, and probably 6 to be safe, because no crew chief wanted to risk running out of fuel on the last lap. Each green flag pit stop cost at minimum 30 seconds, and that was for an elite crew. Factor in slowing down from racing speed, entering pit road, finding your pit box, the actual stop, accelerating back out, and getting back up to speed, and you were losing closer to 45 seconds to a minute of total race time per stop.
Now apply the fuel cooling advantage. With an extra 2 gallons per tank from thermal contraction, plus marginally better fuel economy from the denser, cooler mixture, a car could potentially stretch its fuel runs to 115, maybe even 120 miles. Run those numbers across a 500-mile race. Instead of 5 or 6 stops, you are looking at 4, maybe even 3 if you really pushed the margins and had nerves of steel. Eliminating even a single pit stop was not just about the raw seconds saved sitting on pit road. It was about something far more valuable: track position. In superspeedway racing, track position is everything. The car out front is in clean air. It is dictating the pace. It is controlling where the pack goes and when. When your competitors pit and you stay out, you inherit the lead. You control the race. You decide the tempo. And you avoid the chaotic, dangerous accordion effect that happens when 30 cars try to pit within the same 5-lap window. Pit road in the 1960s was genuinely dangerous. Cars were coming in hot. Crew members were working with minimal safety equipment. Other cars were passing through at speed. Anything that kept you away from pit road was not just a strategic advantage, it was a survival advantage. The fuel cooling trick was, and I do not think this is an exaggeration, a tactical nuclear weapon in an era where strategy was becoming every bit as important as raw speed. The earliest adopters of fuel cooling guarded their secret like it was the formula for eternal life. They went to extraordinary lengths to hide what they were doing. Fuel was cooled in enclosed trailers with locked doors. The transfer to dump cans happened behind curtains or inside the hauler where prying eyes could not see. Team members were sworn to secrecy, and in some cases, only the crew chief and 1 or 2 trusted fuel handlers even knew the full details of the process. But in the close quarters world of NASCAR, where garages are separated by nothing more than a few feet of concrete and everyone is constantly watching everyone else, secrets do not stay secret for very long. By the mid-1960s, eagle-eyed crew members from rival teams started noticing the telltale signs: frost forming on fuel cans in 80-degree Florida heat, teams arriving with unusually elaborate fuel handling equipment that seemed way too sophisticated for simply pouring gas into a car, and most damning of all, cars that seemed to run impossibly long stints on a single tank of fuel, staying out on track while everyone else was pitting lap after lap, mile after mile, defying what should have been mathematically possible. The whispers started in the garage. The rumors spread through the paddock like wildfire, and then the cat-and-mouse game began in earnest. NASCAR officials, who were already overwhelmed trying to police aerodynamic modifications and engine tricks and weight violations and about 47 other forms of creative rule bending, now had an entirely new problem on their hands. They had to worry about fuel temperature. And here's the thing that made this particular problem uniquely maddening for the sanctioning body. How do you even check for something like that? How do you regulate the temperature of a liquid? Early attempts at enforcement were, and I say this with genuine affection for those officials because they were in way over their heads, almost comical. An inspector would walk over with a thermometer, stick it into a fuel can, and take a reading. But by the time they got there, the fuel had already started warming up. Thermal equilibrium waits for nobody. The fuel that had been at 0 degrees when it went into the dump can might be at 30 degrees by the time the inspector ambled over. Was that a violation? The rules did not say. Teams would argue about ambient temperature versus storage temperature versus transport temperature versus delivery temperature. It was a semantic nightmare. And the teams got creative with their deception. Oh man, did they get creative. Some operations ran 2 completely separate sets of fuel cans. One set maintained at perfectly normal room temperature conditions, sitting out in the open for anyone to inspect. These were the show cans, the display models. And then, hidden away in the hauler or behind a partition, a second set of cans, super cool then frosted over, ready for actual race use. The switch
much would happen in the controlled chaos of a pit stop, when officials were watching tire changes and checking lug nuts and making sure nobody went over the wall too early. In that 10-second window of organized mayhem, the warm cans were swapped for the cold ones faster than a street hustler running a shell game. One legendary crew chief, and the stories about this one have been told so many times that they have probably grown in the telling, allegedly had his team spray the outside of warm fuel cans with compressed CO2 right before inspection. The CO2 would create a thin layer of frost on the outside of the can, making it look cold, satisfying the curiosity of any inspector who was relying on visual cues rather than actual temperature measurements. Whether this specific story is entirely true or has been embellished over the decades, it perfectly captures the spirit of the era. These teams were not just racing each other, they were racing the inspectors.
The tech inspection battles over fuel temperature became the stuff of legend in the garage. NASCAR would issue a directive that all fuel must be stored at ambient temperature. Teams would immediately begin arguing about what constituted ambient. Is ambient the temperature outside the hauler or inside the hauler? What if the hauler's air-conditioned to 60 degrees? Is that ambient? What if it is a cool morning and the ambient temperature is 45 degrees? Is naturally cold fuel suddenly illegal? NASCAR would then mandate specific fuel temperature checks at designated times. Teams would develop elaborate protocols to rapidly warm their fuel just before the scheduled check, then cool it back down immediately after. It was a technological arms race fought not with horsepower or aerodynamics, but with thermometers, insulation, and stopwatches. Now, let me walk you through a specific race to show you the real, tangible, on-track impact of this technique. The 1967 Daytona 500, won by Mario Andretti in what remains one of the most celebrated victories in racing history, saw several teams strongly suspected of using supercooled fuel. Andretti's car, a Holman Moody prepared Ford Fairlane, was a beautifully prepared machine in every respect. But what raised eyebrows was the fuel strategy. The Holman Moody Ford completed the entire 500 miles with just 4 pit stops. 4 stops. Meanwhile, several of their direct competitors, running equally fast cars with equally talented drivers, needed 5 stops. That one additional stop cost those teams well over a minute of total race time when you factored in deceleration, the pit stop itself, and acceleration back to race speed. In a race that was decided by margins of seconds, the strategic advantage was not subtle, it was overwhelming. Post-race technical inspection found absolutely nothing illegal about Andretti's fuel system. The fuel cell was regulation size, exactly 22 gallons. The fuel itself was regulation octane, meeting every chemical specification in the rulebook. Everything checked out perfectly, but several competitors filed formal complaints, noting that they had personally witnessed frost forming on the Holman Moody fuel cans during pit stops. Their crews had seen the condensation, they knew what it meant. NASCAR officials found themselves in a genuine bind. There was no rule, not a single line in the entire rulebook that addressed fuel temperature. How could they penalize a team for following the laws of physics? You cannot fine someone for understanding thermodynamics. You cannot disqualify a car because its fuel was cold. The rule said 22 gallons, and the tank held 22 gallons. Case closed. Except the case was anything but closed. The controversy escalated through the following season. By 1968, what had been a quiet advantage for a handful of teams had become an open secret in the garage. More and more teams were investing in fuel cooling equipment. The technology gap between those who had mastered the technique and those who had not was becoming a competitive chasm. Richard Petty's operation, running the famous number 43 Plymouth, was widely suspected of pushing fuel cooling to its absolute extreme. Rumors circulated through the garage that Petty's crew was cooling fuel to negative 20 degrees Fahrenheit. That is colder than a commercial freezer. That's colder than most winter nights in the Carolinas. At that temperature, they could theoretically cram almost 3 extra gallons into their regulation fuel cell, nearly 14% more fuel than anyone else on the grid.
Petty went on to win 16 races during the 1968 season, a staggering number that still stands as one of the most dominant single-season performances in NASCAR history. Petty himself always maintained, with that easy Carolina charm that made him the king of stock car racing, that his team was simply maximizing their fuel strategy within the rules as written. He was not wrong. The rules as written said nothing about temperature.
The scientific arms race escalated with breathtaking speed. Teams that had started with ice chests and bags of ice were now hiring chemical engineers as consultants. These engineers calculated optimal fuel temperatures for different ambient conditions, different fuel blends, and different race lengths. They created charts and tables that told the crew chief exactly how cold to make the fuel for maximum advantage at every track on the schedule. Some teams experimented with different fuel blends that had more favorable thermal expansion characteristics. They worked with fuel suppliers to develop custom formulations that contracted more dramatically at low temperatures while still meeting NASCAR's chemical specifications. Others tried adding substances to the fuel that would lower its freezing point even further, allowing for more extreme cooling without the risk of the fuel actually solidifying in the lines. One team, according to garage area lore that has been repeated so many times it has achieved the status of gospel truth, experimented with injecting small amounts of liquid nitrogen directly into the fuel tank during pit stops. The liquid nitrogen would rapidly cool the fuel already in the tank, causing it to contract and making room for additional fuel from the dump cans. The idea was theoretically sound, but practically terrifying. Liquid nitrogen in proximity to gasoline inside a hot race car surrounded by open flames and electrical systems? The potential for catastrophe was obvious, and the experiment was apparently abandoned after a single test that scared everyone involved badly enough to never try it again. The safety concerns surrounding fuel cooling were real, and they were mounting. Supercooled fuel created several genuine hazards that went beyond the normal dangers of handling volatile liquids. First and most immediate was the risk of cold burns and frostbite for crew members handling the frozen cans. Metal dump cans at 0 degrees or below would freeze to expose skin on contact. Several crew members reportedly suffered cold burns during the height of the fuel cooling era, though most injuries went unreported because admitting you were cooling your fuel was essentially admitting you were exploiting a gray area. Second, and this was the one that kept crew chiefs up at night, the extreme temperature differential between super cold fuel and scorching hot engine components created tremendous thermal stress on every part the fuel touched. Fuel lines that were designed to handle fuel at ambient temperatures were suddenly being asked to carry fluid that was 70, 80, even 90 degrees colder than expected. The rapid thermal cycling, cold fuel flowing through lines that would heat up during green flag runs and then get blasted with cold fuel again at the next pit stop, could cause hairline cracks in rubber hoses, loosen fittings, and stress metal fuel lines until they develop pinhole leaks. A pinhole fuel leak on a race car running at 180 miles per hour with exhaust temperatures exceeding 1,000 degrees was not a minor inconvenience. It was a potential fireball. Third, and this was a subtler problem that only the most scientifically literate teams fully appreciated, was the risk of fuel component separation. Gasoline is not a single chemical. It is a complex mixture of hundreds of different hydrocarbon compounds, each with its own freezing point, its own viscosity curve, and its own behavior at extreme temperatures. Cool the mixture far enough, and some components begin to fall out of solution, separating from the rest of the fuel like oil separating from vinegar. This separated fuel could clog filters, gum up carburetor jets, and cause the engine to stumble, misfire, or fail entirely at the worst possible moment. More than one engine failure during this era was quietly attributed to fuel separation issues by teams who had pushed the cooling too far.
There was also the elephant in the room that nobody wanted to talk about publicly, but everybody was thinking about privately: competitive integrity. Fuel cooling technology was not cheap. The refrigeration equipment, insulated storage containers, specialized handling gear, temperature monitoring instruments, and the engineering expertise to make it all work reliably cost tens of thousands of dollars. In today's money, adjusted for inflation, we're talking about 6 figures worth of fuel cooling infrastructure. The factory-backed teams from Ford and Chrysler could absorb that cost without blinking. For them, it was a line item on an already massive racing budget. But for the independent teams, the privateer operations, running on sponsorship money from local car dealerships and hardware stores, it was completely out of reach. The gap between the haves and the have-nots, already wide in 1960s NASCAR, was growing into a canyon. The fuel-pulling arms race was threatening to destroy the competitive balance that made the sport compelling to fans. NASCAR found itself trapped in what seemed like an impossible position. How do you regulate temperature? Unlike a mechanical modification that you can measure with a caliper, photograph with a camera, and point to in the rulebook, temperature is ephemeral. It changes every second. Fuel that is illegal at the moment it goes into the dump can could be perfectly legal by the time someone sticks a thermometer in it 30 seconds later. The physics of heat transfer meant that enforcement would always be one step behind the teams. It was like trying to catch water in your hands. The tipping point finally came during the 1969 Talladega 500. This race was already a controversy magnet due to serious tire safety concerns at the brand new Alabama International Motor Speedway, with many of NASCAR's top drivers, including Richard Petty himself, boycotting the event in protest. But those who did race pushed the fuel cooling envelope to its absolute breaking point. Multiple teams were running fuel so cold that condensation was forming and then freezing into visible ice crystals on the fuel cell vents inside the cars. You could see it from the grandstands. The disparity in pit stop strategies was obvious to everyone watching: fans, media, officials, everyone. Some cars were running 20 miles further per stint than others on the exact same size fuel tank. It did not take a physics degree to figure out something was going on. After the race, tech inspection turned into something closer to a chemistry lecture than a mechanical review, with officials attempting to determine not just if the fuel was cold, but how cold it had been and when exactly it had been cooled. The rulebook offered zero guidance. For the 1970 season, NASCAR finally acted. A new regulation appeared in the technical specifications, tucked in among hundreds of other rules. It stated simply that fuel must be maintained at a temperature no lower than 50 degrees Fahrenheit as measured at the time of delivery to the vehicle. Simple, clear, enforceable. Sort of. Teams immediately found loopholes. The rule specified at the time of delivery, but what about 10 minutes before delivery? What about the storage temperature? Could you cool the fuel to 20 degrees and then warm it to exactly 50.1 degrees right before pouring? What if the natural ambient temperature on a cold race morning at Martinsville in October was 43 degrees? Was naturally cold fuel suddenly a violation? The lawyers and the crew chiefs were having a field day. NASCAR responded with amendment after amendment, clarification after clarification. Random temperature checks would be conducted in the garage area and on pit road without warning. Teams had to provide unrestricted access to their fuel storage at all times during the race weekend. Any attempt to artificially cool fuel below the minimum temperature would result in disqualification and loss of all points and prize money. The penalties were severe, and the message was unmistakable. NASCAR meant business. The 1970 season became a test of wills. Multiple teams were penalized early in the year for temperature violations, some minor, fuel measured at 48 instead of 50, and some blatant, with fuel discovered at near freezing temperatures sitting in modified coolers behind the hauler. Officials carried calibrated digital thermometers and conducted unannounced spot checks throughout every race weekend. The era of fuel cooling was effectively over. But the teams adapted. They always adapt. That is what racers do. If they could not cool the fuel, they would find other advantages. Some focused on fuel pickup system improvements, engineering better baffling and pickup tube designs that allowed them to run the tank closer to completely dry without experiencing fuel starvation. Others poured their energy into aerodynamic refinements that reduced drag and improved fuel economy by fractions of a mile per gallon. The innovation did not stop. It never stops. It just changed direction. One particularly clever team developed what they called a thermal management strategy that technically complied with every letter of the new rule. They could not cool the fuel below 50 degrees, fine, but they could heat everything else. By running intentionally higher engine coolant temperatures and installing heat exchangers that warmed the fuel rails and intake manifold to extreme temperatures, they created a massive temperature differential when the legal 50-degree fuel entered the system. The cold fuel entering the superheated intake still provided meaningful charge cooling benefits, still densified the air-fuel mixture, still gave them a small power advantage. It was not as dramatic as the old days of near-frozen fuel, but it was something. And in racing, something is everything.
The legacy of the fuel cooling era extends far beyond the garage at Daytona. The same principles that NASCAR mechanics exploited in the 1960s are now standard practice in aviation, where airlines calculate fuel density at different temperatures to optimize payload and range calculations. Fuel loaded on a cold morning in Anchorage weighs more per gallon than fuel loaded on a hot afternoon in Phoenix, and the airlines account for every single pound. The racing world's illicit discovery became the aviation industry's standard operating procedure. Looking back across the decades, the fuel freezing trick was more than just a clever hack by creative mechanics. It represented something fundamental about the spirit of motorsport innovation. It was proof that the biggest competitive advantages do not always come from the most expensive technology or the most powerful engines. Sometimes they come from understanding the basic properties of the materials you are working with. Sometimes they come from a guy in the back of the garage who paid attention in high school chemistry class when everyone else was daydreaming. The next time you fill up your car on a cold morning and notice the pump seems to run a little differently, remember those NASCAR mechanics from half a century ago. Remember that they looked at the exact same physics you experience every day at the gas station and saw not just a scientific curiosity, but a competitive weapon that changed racing. Remember that they stared at a problem everyone else had accepted as unsolvable, a fixed fuel tank that held exactly 22 gallons and nothing more, and they found the answer not in engineering, but in thermodynamics. That is what makes motorsports special. It is not always about who has the most money or the best equipment. Sometimes it is about who sees the world differently, who questions the assumptions that everyone else takes for granted, who understands that every rule has a boundary, every limitation has a workaround, and every problem has a solution if you are willing to think creatively enough to find it. Those mechanics who cooled their fuel to near zero did not just find 2 extra gallons of capacity. They found a truth about racing that still holds today. The team that wins is not always the fastest. Sometimes it is the smartest. Sometimes it is the one that understands that the rules of physics are more powerful than any rulebook ever written. What is the most creative rule bending you have ever heard of in motorsports? Drop it in the comments below. I want to hear your favorite stories of racing ingenuity. And if you enjoyed this deep dive into NASCAR's wildest chemistry experiment, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because we are just getting started exploring the incredible engineering stories that shaped the racing world.